June 2nd, 1899. Near dawn, the westbound Union Pacific Overland Flyer No. 1 pulled out of Wilcox, Wyoming into heavy rain and a sky without stars, the first section of the train rolling into open country while the second section still stood in the station behind it. In the lead locomotive cab, engineer William Grindstone Jones watched the wet rails ahead while his fireman worked the shovel, both men damp from spray that drifted through the open cab windows. Behind them, the head end of the train carried an Ogden mail car, an express car for the Pacific Express Company, another mail and baggage car, and then the sleepers and a private car where several hundred passengers tried to sleep through the steady rhythm of wheels and the hiss of steam. The line across central Wyoming had brought speed and regularity to a country of sparse towns and long miles of range, but it had also created a moving target that carried money, negotiable paper, and valuables through isolated stretches every night. In the broken country north of the tracks around Brown's Park and the hole-in-the-wall country, riders connected to the loose alliance later known as Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch studied those schedules closely. They knew which trains carried strong boxes of cash and unsigned banknotes, which run slowed on grades or at fragile trestles, and where a handful of armed messengers and clerks stood between a safe and the open range. For Wilcox, they chose a small bridge a short distance west of town, a wooden trestle over a shallow gulch that every engineer on the division knew by feel. In the days before the robbery, horses had been placed along escape routes that ran away from the tracks into rough breaks and draws. Kegs and boxes of dynamite and blasting powder drawn from supply houses and mines were brought in and hidden near the bridge. The plan focused on forcing the first section of the Overland Flyer to stop just before or just beyond that trestle, using the bridge as both a threat and a barrier between the two sections of the train. Shortly after leaving Wilcox, Jones eased the throttle open and felt the locomotive dig into the slight grade. Rain beat on the cab roof and swept across the headlights' beam in gray sheets. Somewhere ahead, the wooden trestle waited in the dark. As the headlight pierced the night, Jones saw a red and white lantern swinging beside the track. It moved with the steady pattern of a regulation railroad signal, not the uncertain waving of a stranger. With fresh storms in mind and a bridge just beyond that spot, he shut off steam and set the air, bringing the heavy train down toward a stop while lamps swayed in the sleepers and passengers surfaced groggily from their berths. Jones leaned from the cab expecting a trackman in oilskins. Instead, a masked rider stepped out of the darkness, caught the handrail, and swung into the cab with a revolver already drawn. Another masked outlaw climbed in behind him. Both men had their faces darkened, their eyes bright through rough-cut openings in the cloth masks that hung from their hats. Jones and his firemen raised their hands. Over the noise of escaping steam, the lead outlaw ordered the engineer to move the train across the bridge and stop on the far side, and he made clear that any hesitation would be answered with gunfire or dynamite. The locomotive rolled onto the trestle with the masked man at Jones's shoulder. In the gulch below, sticks of dynamite already sat against one of the supports, fuses prepared earlier that night. As soon as the engine, tender, and head-end cars cleared the span, the outlaw told Jones to stop. A heavy blast followed moments later. The explosion shook the bridge and sent splinters and earth into the air. The structure did not collapse into the gulch, but part of its frame shattered, leaving the second section of the Overland Flyer trapped behind the wrecked bent and unable to follow without risking a derailment. In the rear coaches of the first section, passengers lurched awake as brakes gripped the wheels and the concussion from the blast rolled through the cars. Oil lamps swung violently, throwing shadows across narrow aisles. Mothers pulled children close. Men in travel suits felt the floor shudder and wondered whether the boiler had burst or another train had collided with them in the dark. No one in the sleepers saw more than flashes of light through rain-streaked windows and strange shapes moving near the head of the train. But fear spread from berth to berth as people whispered guesses regarding what had happened. At the front, a different kind of order took hold. The two outlaws who had entered the cab forced Jones and his firemen down to the track with rifles and pistols pointed at them. More riders appeared from the darkness along the right-of-way, each masked and armed. One man kept the crew covered while another asked quick questions about the men in the mail and express cars. Jones knew that those cars sitting directly behind the tender held the cash, the negotiable paper, and small packages of valuables. He tried to answer cautiously, but the sight of horses tied among the low sagebrush made it clear that the men facing him had prepared this stop in detail. Behind the head end, the train finished in passenger cars, including a sleeper full of travelers and a private car reserved for a wealthy guest. Conductor William Story stepped down with his lantern as soon as he felt the stop. It was his job to learn why the train had halted so soon after leaving Wilcox. He walked forward into the headlights' glow and found himself looking straight into the barrel of a rifle. A masked robber ordered him to stand still and remain silent. In the brief circle of light, Story saw more armed men around the locomotive and realized that this was a full train holdup, not a routine delay. The outlaws needed the front cars without the burden of the rear coaches. Under their guns, Jones and the firemen uncoupled the passenger section. Then, with riders on the steps and walking beside the wheels, the locomotive eased forward again, pulling only the tender, the Ogden mail car, the express car, and the Portland mail and baggage car. The passenger coaches and the private car stayed behind on the damaged line, full of people who could hear blasts and shouts in the distance but had no clear view of what was happening to the head end of their train. Inside the Ogden mail car, Chief Clerk W.G. Bart. Bruce worked with clerks Robert Lawson and Len Dietrich among pouches and sacks stacked along both walls. The narrow car rocked gently as they sorted and stamped, their oil lamps burning steady overhead. When the train first stopped, Lawson slid the side door open a fraction to see whether a station platform had appeared outside. Only dark prairie and low outline hills showed in the gloom. He closed the door again, thinking of a simple delay rather than danger, and the clerks went back to their work. The car jerked forward, moved a short distance, and stopped once more. Then a voice outside called for a man who did not exist, shouting a name none of the clerks recognized. Bruce and his crew exchanged puzzled looks. When Dietrich cracked the door to answer the call, a rifle muzzle pushed through the opening, backed by a masked man who ordered the clerks out. Bruce tried to stall, saying the man being called for was not there, and that there was no reason for anyone inside to leave the car. The response came as threats and a count that left no doubt the outlaws would force the issue. Bruce slammed the door shut. The three clerks looked around their cramped workspace and saw no revolvers, no shotguns, nothing that could meet rifles. An oath to protect the mail had brought them here, but oak planking and their own bodies were the only barriers between the sacks and the men outside. Heavy blows soon landed against the door as an outlaw tried to hack through the thick timbers with a coal pick. When that failed to open a gap, the robbers pushed sticks of dynamite against the base of the door, ran out fuses, and lit them while the men inside dove for the floor. The blast ripped the entrance away. The explosion tore the door from its hinges, filled the interior with smoke and dust, and hurled splinters through the car. Lanterns shattered and left the compartment in half-light. Boards creaked and mail sacks split open. Ears rang. From outside came shouts and a few rifle shots through the jagged opening, fired low to remind the clerks that the guns remained ready. With no door left to bar and nothing to fight with, Bruce and his partners climbed unsteadily out, hands up, to face masked men who searched them and marched them forward to join the captured crew. In the express car behind them, Pacific Express Company messenger Charles Woodcock had felt the same jolt and heard the same explosion. His car held a heavy safe bolted to the floor, loaded earlier that night with packages of currency, unsigned banknotes, and small valuables. Woodcock traveled this line often and knew that train robbers watched for such shipments. When the train first stopped, he thought of mechanical trouble. When the blast tore the mail car door away, he understood that the express car stood next in line. Woodcock moved quickly. He took down his shotgun and a pistol, checked the safe, and turned the lamps low until the interior lay in near darkness. Then he took a position that gave him a view of both doors and leveled the shotgun at the nearest one. Outside, he heard masked men ordering the crew around and calling on him to open up. He refused. His job was to stand between that safe and whoever wanted it. The car's heavy planking and the steel of the safe were all he had in his favor. He intended to use both as long as he could. The outlaws treated his refusal as another problem for dynamite. They set charges at the express car door, lit the fuses, and stepped back. A sharp blast followed. The explosion blew the door outward, stripped away part of the siding, and flung splinters and iron fragments through the compartment. Woodcock was knocked off his feet and slammed against the floor, stunned and half-deaf. Smoke rolled through the car in thick clouds. Bits of shattered wood and metal clattered down around him. For a moment he could not tell whether he was whole, only that everything rang and the light from the ruined doorway looked distant. Under the muzzle of a rifle, Jones was ordered into the wrecked express car to see if the messenger still lived. The engineer climbed through the ragged opening into a wrecked space full of dust and the sharp smell of burnt powder. Boards lay torn up, packing crates splintered, iron brackets bent. Somewhere in the gloom, Woodcock still gripped his shotgun, trying to decide whether the figure coming toward him was an outlaw or a fellow railroad man. Only when he recognized Jones did he lower the weapon. The engineer helped him outside, where he stood unsteadily on the ballast, face bruised, clothing scorched, and blood running from cuts on his head. The safe still stood inside, bolted to the battered floor. Its door remained sealed. Woodcock knew the combination and kept it to himself. The gang did not waste time trying to work the dial. They hauled in more dynamite, stacked the sticks against the safe, and lit another fuse while the captured crew and clerks were ordered to turn away. A second blast shook the short train and sent another cloud of debris into the rain. The force lifted the roof of the express car, blew out more wall sections, and buckled the safe door until it sprang open. Now the trackside scene around the head end looked like a small wrecking yard. The Ogden mail car gaped where its door had been. The express car lay half open, roof warped, sides jagged and exposed to the weather. Splintered planks, twisted iron, and fragments of crates and fittings littered the ballast. Steam hissed from the locomotive. Smoke from the charges mixed with the smell of wet wood and coal. The rain slackened, but still fell hard enough to soak the prisoners on the ground and turn the shallow craters around the cars into muddy puddles. The outlaws climbed into the ruined express car and went straight to the open safe. They scooped up packets of banknotes, bundles of currency, and small valuables such as scarf pins, cuff buttons, and watches, filling gunny sacks and saddlebags without pausing to count. Later, the railroad and express company would admit that tens of thousands of dollars were gone, some of it in gold. For the crew on the ground, the precise sum mattered less than the simple fact that the entire heart of the express operation on that train had been torn open and nothing stood between those sacks and the men carrying them away into the hills. Back on the uncoupled passenger cars, passengers felt each blast and heard distant shouts but could see little through the rain and darkness. Some lay flat in their berths and prayed that no bullets would punch through the car sides. Others gathered in the aisles wrapped in coats and blankets. Conductor Story moved through the coaches as much as the armed men at the front would allow, urging everyone to stay calm. He explained that the gang wanted the safe, not the jewelry boxes and wallets in ordinary luggage, and that any panic could provoke needless shooting. No passenger died at Wilcox, but the strain of waiting in the dark while dynamite tore at the cars ahead left its own mark. When the bandits had loaded all they could carry, they ordered the crew to stay where they were until the riders reached their horses. The gang mounted and disappeared into the broken country, leaving the blown cars behind. Only then did Jones climb back into his locomotive, ease the train over the damaged bridge, and nurse the crippled head end toward Medicine Bow. Dawn found the first section of the overland flyer limping into that station with a wrecked express car, a blasted mail car, a bruised messenger, and a wounded engineer with a scalp cut and torn hand. From Medicine Bow, Jones sent the telegram that flashed the news of the Wilcox robbery across the railroad. He reported that the first section of the overland flyer number 1 had been held up west of Wilcox, that the express and mail cars had been blown open, and that the safe's contents were gone. Union Pacific officials in Omaha quickly offered a reward for each robber, dead or alive, and ordered the special posse train in Laramie to steam out with horses, food, and armed men. The Pacific Express Company and the federal government matched the reward. Within a day, nearly 100 railroad detectives, sheriffs, deputies, and volunteers were riding in relays through the hills and draws of central Wyoming. The posse train reached the shattered trestle and the wrecked cars, then followed the line of tracks away from the rails. They saw where the robbers had left the right-of-way and where fresh horses had been waiting. Trails ran north and west toward ground that had long sheltered bands of rustlers and hold-up men. The descriptions of the robbers' clothing, speech, and methods matched names already familiar to lawmen and railroad investigators. Reports and later indictments tied the job to men around Butch Cassidy, including Harvey Logan, George Curry, Ben Kilpatrick, and the Sundance Kid, though no jury ever sat all of them down together for this robbery alone. The gang that had robbed the overland flyer used relay strings of horses, sympathetic ranches, and intimate knowledge of the country to stay ahead of the pursuit. Over the next months, individual riders would die in shootouts or land in prison, but there was no single day when a posse brought the entire Wilcox crew to bay at once. What did change was how the railroad and much of the region saw train robbery. Before Wilcox, many executives still viewed holdups as local affairs that sheriffs could handle with a few men and perhaps a short chase. After Wilcox, every man who read Jones's telegram and saw the smashed express car understood that organized outlaws with dynamite and planning could rip open a main line run in the middle of the night. In the months that followed, safes grew heavier, and more express cars carried armed guards. Special trains sat ready under steam, prepared to move posses the moment a wire mentioned trouble. Photographs and descriptions of suspects tied to the Wilcox holdup passed from office to office and from state to state. Lawmen began to track certain gangs across entire regions rather than treating them as local nuisances. At the same time, the riders around Cassidy felt the new pressure and the new opportunity. The Wilcox money paid for better horses, more weapons, and longer stays in distant hideouts, even as the size of the haul guaranteed that railroad detectives and Pinkerton men would not let the case fade from their ledgers. For men in the outlaw camps, the lesson of Wilcox was simple. A carefully chosen stretch of track, a weak bridge, relay horses, and a few boxes of dynamite could bring in a fortune that rivaled years of rustling. For the railroad, the same night showed how vulnerable a train remained when a handful of armed men controlled a locomotive and a stretch of isolated line. Caught between those two truths stood people like Charles Woodcock, whose battered figure stepping out of a wrecked express car became a symbol inside company offices of both duty and risk. A little more than a year later, his path and the paths of the men who had learned from Wilcox would cross again near a lonely siding named Tipton, where another express safe, another line of cars, and another set of charges would test how long a gang could keep winning before its own methods helped bring it down. On the morning of June 3rd, 1899, Sheriff Josiah Hazen saddled his horse in Douglas while telegraph instruments clicked inside the depot with reports of the Wilcox holdup. The wires carried a steady flow of details from section houses and yards. But for Hazen, the message boiled down to one clear fact. Armed riders had blown open an express car on the main line, ridden away with a heavy haul, and left one of the county's most important routes scarred and shaken. He cinched his saddle tight, checked the loads in his Winchester, and stepped into a role that would end his life within days. Ranch hands and townsmen gathered in the street as he called for volunteers. Some wore spurs polished by years of cow work. Others still smelled of coal smoke from the roundhouse. All understood the gravity of the call. They listened while Hazen described the need for men who could ride hard, sleep little, and follow a trail across rough country where the robbers already knew the draws and ridges. When he finished, more than a dozen stepped forward. Within an hour, they had packed bedrolls, ammunition, and food enough for several days. The posse left Douglas at a trot, following the telephone and telegraph poles toward the scene of the holdup. Dust rose from the road and settled on hat brims and shirt collars. The men rode mostly in silence, saving breath for the work ahead. At the siding where the damaged cars now stood, railroad detectives met them and walked them through the latest information without repeating the full story of the previous night. Hazen learned the general direction the robbers had taken and how many horses had been seen. He studied the ground near the tracks, nodded once, and turned his horse toward the low hills. Trackers in Hazen's group read sign and details that a casual rider would overlook. A scuffed stone, a bent stem of grass, a faint crescent in damp soil, each one spoke of horses moving in a hurry. The line of tracks wound away from the railroad into sagebrush flats and shallow coulees. In places, the gang had broken into a run. Hoof marks dug deep and clods of earth lay behind them. The posse followed at a steady pace that balanced urgency with the need to keep their own horses in condition for a long pursuit. Farther west, Carbon County Sheriff Joe Young assembled his own riders. His men worked from Rawlins and nearby ranches, forming a second line of pursuit that aimed to intercept the robbers as they moved toward traditional outlaw refuges. Young coordinated with railroad detectives who had stepped off a special train with fresh horses and crates of provisions. They shared maps and rough sketches of the country north of the line, marking suspected relay points and waterholes that could sustain a group of fugitives. The gang that left the Wilcox scene had prepared for this attention. At the first relay point, Hazen's posse found sweat-darkened blankets and strips of rawhide that had recently been cut loose. The horses that had stood there were gone, replaced by fresh animals carrying the band its next stage. Tracks led away through a gap in the hills. A chewed plug of tobacco lay near a cold fire, and beside it a ragged piece of cloth that had once covered a face. Hazen pocketed the fragment without comment. Every small piece would help later when he described the chase. Days settled into a brutal pattern. The men rose before sunrise and choked down coffee and cold biscuits, then tightened girths and checked cinches while the air still held a chill. As the sun climbed, the heat pressed against wool shirts and heavy vests. Lips cracked. Dust mixed with sweat and formed a thin crust on skin and leather. The only real breaks came when they dismounted to study a confusing patch of tracks or to water the horses at short stretches of running creek. The trail led through broken country marked by sandstone ridges and narrow draws. In several locations, the gang split its tracks, sending small groups off in different directions before merging again beyond the next ridge. Hazen understood the tactic. If a posse chose the wrong branch at a fork, it would lose time looping back. Once, after an hour on one branch, his trackers stopped and shook their heads. The hoofprints grew lighter and finally disappeared on bare rock. They turned back, picked up the correct fork, and pushed their tired mounts forward again. The first direct contact came near a place locals called Canyon Springs, where a small creek wound between low cliffs and scattered pines. Hazen's men approached cautiously, aware that any bend in the watercourse could conceal rifles. Fresh sign lay along the bank. Hooves had chopped the soft ground and a few splintered willow branches suggested recent movement. Hazen signaled for a slow advance and rode near the front, rifle laid across his saddle horn. Shots slammed into the stillness without warning. Muzzle flashes winked from rocks above the creek bed, and the flat crack of rifles rolled along the canyon walls. Bullets kicked up water and slammed into tree trunks. Horses plunged and squealed. One of the posse riders pitched from his saddle with his hat spinning away. Others slid to the ground and used the low creek bank as cover, returning fire at the brief flashes high on the slope. Hazen saw his man fall and stepped into the open in an effort to reach the wounded rider. As he ran across the exposed ground, a bullet struck him in the chest. Witnesses later recalled that he staggered but continued forward for several steps before collapsing near the edge of the water. The posse tried to drag him back under cover, but every attempt drew a fresh volley from the rocks. For several long minutes he lay still while men on both sides fired and reloaded in a harsh rhythm. When the outlaws finally broke contact and rode away along the ridge, the survivors moved to Hazen's side. Blood stained his shirt and his eyes had lost focus. No surgeon rode with the group, and the closest doctor stood many miles away in a town that lay far beyond the horizon. Hazen died there beside the creek that afternoon. His men wrapped his body in a blanket and placed it across a led horse. Then they turned back toward Douglas, leaving a portion of the gang's trail unexplored in order to give their sheriff an escorted return. Hazen's funeral brought a large crowd to Douglas. Townspeople lined the streets in plain work clothes. Law officers from other counties and from the railroad stood near the front, badges polished, hats held in their hands as the coffin passed. Speakers at the service framed his death in clear terms. A posse looking for train robbers had walked into an ambush, and a respected sheriff had fallen to rifle fire from men who had already shown their disregard for life by blasting mail and express cars where clerks and messengers worked. Newspapers picked up the story and carried it across the region. Columns in Cheyenne, Denver, and Omaha described the Wilcox robbers not simply as thieves but as organized outlaws willing to kill officers and wreck trains in pursuit of cash. Editorials called for coordinated action. The tone in those columns left no room for compromise or negotiation. Readers learned that the railroad and the express company had raised their rewards, that federal authorities were involved because the mail had been attacked, and that any citizen with information regarding the gang had a duty to step forward. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency joined the case formally as those articles circulated. The firm already had experience tracking mobile gangs, and its previous work with railroads gave it direct access to company offices and records. Assignments went out from Chicago and Denver to operatives who knew cattle country and railroad towns. They received simple instructions. Identify the men behind the Wilcox robbery and build cases strong enough to stand in court or justify rewards when those men fell in gunfights. One key figure in that effort, Charles Siringo, took on a familiar disguise as a cattle buyer. He moved quietly through Browns Park, the hole-in-the-wall region, and similar hideouts where riders sympathetic to the Wild Bunch had long traded horses and stories. Siringo kept his questions mild and his manner easy. He drank in saloons with ranch hands, sat near stoves in lined shacks, and rode out with men who knew remote canyons. In his notebooks, he recorded more than brands and stock counts. He noted which names caused conversations to slow, which trails led to cabins far from any mapped road, and which ranches seemed to support more saddle stock than their official herds required. Other Pinkerton men followed different leads. Some traveled on trains and watched for patterns in ticket purchases and freight shipments. They talked with conductors who remembered certain passengers returning again and again on specific runs. They listened to express messengers who had seen strangers loiter near depots, studying consists as trains stood for water or orders. Names such as Robert Leroy Parker, Harvey Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, and Harry Longabaugh appeared repeatedly in these reports, linked to movements that matched the paths of earlier robberies or suspicious gatherings. For the outlaws, the early months after Wilcox carried a mixed tension and comfort. Money from the safe allowed them to buy high-quality horses, new saddles, and reliable firearms. In hidden camps, they cooked whatever fresh meat they could obtain, rolled cigarettes from fine tobacco, and played cards under lantern light. They gave each other nicknames that hid legal identities which Pinkerton files slowly uncovered from old arrest records and earlier investigations. The men knew they were hunted, yet the immediate pursuit around Canyon Springs had failed to capture them, and that failure gave them confidence. They adjusted their habits in response to the growing pressure. Trips into town for supplies took place at night or during bad weather when fewer eyes watched the streets. When they rode into a settlement such as Baggs or Meeker, they did so in smaller groups and left quickly once business finished. Appearance shifted as well. Beards were shaved or grown out, hat styles changed. Coats stayed buttoned in ways that altered the drape of shoulders and torsos. These details mattered when a sheriff or detective tried to match a real man at a bar to a grainy sketch on a circular. While these subtle changes played out along the frontier, some gang members chose to spend time in larger cities where a man with ready money could blend into street crowds more easily. Fort Worth, Texas became an important stop. The city had cattle yards, rail depots, and a bustling downtown with hotels, gambling houses, and photography studios that advertised portraits with sharp focus and modern backdrops. Money from the Wyoming holdup paid for fine suits, soft shirts, and fashionable hats that gave the riders the appearance of prosperous businessmen. In early 1900, a group of these men climbed the stairs to the John Swartz studio on Main Street in Fort Worth. Inside, the photographer adjusted his camera and directed them to stand and sit in positions that would balance the frame. They wore dark suits, stiff collars, silk ties, and polished shoes. Some rested gloved hands on canes. 2 took seats while 3 stood behind them. The faces were those of Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Harvey Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, and Will Carver. They met the lens with steady expressions that showed no hint of haste or fear. Swartz printed multiple copies of the group portrait and displayed one in his window as proof of his skill. Other prints made their way into nearby saloons and boarding houses where a well-dressed group of cattlemen or businessmen made a pleasant decoration. One of those prints caught the eye of a law officer who had read reports regarding the Wild Bunch. The officer studied the photograph, compared it to written descriptions and earlier sketches, and saw strong similarities. He obtained a copy and passed it to railroad detectives and Pinkerton agents. Once the image reached Pinkerton offices, it became a central reference point. Operatives compared each face to notes gathered in Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. Details such as a narrow nose, a particular jawline, or a distinctive set to the eyes matched prior descriptions. The agency produced cropped images of each man and labeled them with the names already tied to the Wilcox robbery and other crimes. These smaller photographs traveled outward in envelopes to sheriff's offices, railroad divisions, and federal marshals. Clerks pinned the images to office walls. Sheriffs taped them behind their desks. Newspapers reproduced them in black and white columns that carried headlines naming the men as dangerous train robbers and killers. Citizens saw the portraits posted near depot ticket windows and in post offices. The effect was immediate. A man who resembled any of the faces now carried a risk whenever he walked down a main street, stepped into a saloon, or bought a ticket at a station. Union Pacific used this period to harden its defenses as well. Special agents rode trains like ordinary passengers while quietly noting suspicious behavior. Additional guards rode in express cars on key runs armed with rifles and shotguns kept close at hand rather than locked away. Engineers received explicit instructions regarding unusual signals along the right-of-way. Conductors learned to treat unscheduled stops with greater suspicion and to move quickly toward the engine when the train halted in isolated stretches. The gang watched those changes with careful attention. They counted armed men when they saw trains pass from vantage points on hills. They studied the new placement of safes within express cars and noticed which runs carried guards and which did not. Experience at Wilcox had proven the power of dynamite against car doors and strongboxes. The months that followed taught them that the same violent methods drew a level of pursuit that grew more intense with every new detail that Pinkerton reports and newspaper stories added. By early 1900, the lines of pursuit and evasion had grown tightly interwoven. Posses had failed to bring the Wilcox robbers into custody. Yet the faces on the Fort Worth photograph no longer floated as vague images in rumor. They stared back from office walls and reward notices. The gang had more money, more weapons, and more knowledge of how railroads responded to attack. The law had clearer targets and better coordination. That balance set the stage for the decisions that would lead Harvey Logan and his companions to study a lonely siding near Tipton and prepare another set of charges for another Union Pacific Express. Convinced that one more robbery could secure their fortunes even as the noose around them drew tighter. In the spring of 1900, the Union Pacific Main Line across southern Wyoming carried more heavily guarded trains and stronger safes than it had a year earlier. And every new length of wire and armed guard grew out of fear that men connected with Butch Cassidy would strike again. The memory of the Wilcox holdup had not faded inside the railroad offices in Omaha, and the company's chairman, Edward Harriman, pushed his superintendents to close every weakness that robbery had exposed. Telegraph instruments rattled through the night in depots from Cheyenne to Ogden. Telephone lines spread between division points, and special agents rode trains that once had relied only on conductors and brakemen for protection. Pressure did not rest only on the railroad. Governors and sheriffs across the region spoke publicly of the Wild Bunch and other organized gangs, and their words reached the scattered camps where outlaws drank coffee, cleaned rifles, and listened for news that might threaten them. Robert Leroy Parker, known across the frontier as Butch Cassidy, tried to balance the promises he had made to friends who wanted him to leave robbery behind and the loyalty he felt toward the men who still depended on him for plans, contacts, and safe routes. He had spoken with Utah's governor and lawyers connected to the Union Pacific concerning a settlement that might keep him out of prison if he stopped attacking the railroad. Yet during that same period, his name continued to appear in reports from banks and trains that had been robbed by organized bands of horsemen. Harvey Logan faced a different kind of pressure during those months. The man many newspapers called Kid Curry had moved from calculated robbery into a succession of shootings that pushed him into a narrower corner every week. In May 1900, he and his companions had been confronted near Moab, Utah, by Sheriff Jesse Tyler and a small party of deputies intent on earning the large rewards now attached to Curry's name. The meeting ended in gunfire on a scrub hillside. Tyler and Deputy Samuel Jenkins fell. Curry and his men escaped, and word of the killings moved across telegraph wires into every sheriff's office within range of the wires. Curry's reputation, already blackened by earlier killings in Colorado and Montana, hardened further. For lawmen, he became a symbol of the Wild Bunch at its most dangerous, and that reputation tied him even more tightly to Cassidy and the other riders who planned the next large strike. While posses shifted their attention from Colorado to Utah and back toward Wyoming, the circles of people who fed information to either side also tightened. Ranchers who had once refused to cooperate with distant authorities began to consider the damage that train holdups and bank raids inflicted on local trade. At the same time, small numbers of stockmen, merchants, and drifters continued to pass word to Cassidy's friends when strangers arrived, when posses bought grain, or when Pinkerton detectives were seen near a railhead. The result was a region where nearly every settlement from Montpelier to Green River held at least one person willing to warn an outlaw and at least one person determined to see him hanged. Cassidy's core strength remained his ability to organize men and routes. By 1900, he had spent years creating a loose chain of hideouts from southern Wyoming through Utah and into northern Arizona. Hole-in-the-Wall country in Johnson County, Browns Park along the Green River, and Robber's Roost among the canyons of central Utah all served as places where riders could rest and where stolen horses and supplies could be cached for later use. Relay strings allowed the gang to move quickly across wide distances once a robbery had been carried out. Fresh animals waited at intervals across the high plains and desert plateaus, placed earlier by helpers who rarely knew more than the time they were expected to have horses ready. Those same strengths made Cassidy valuable to men who were not always present when he spoke with lawyers or governors. Harry Longabaugh, known as the Sundance Kid, shifted in and out of Wyoming and Colorado. Ben Kilpatrick, remembered in Texas as the Tall Texan, looked for work and opportunity wherever cattle outfits or railroads moved money in quantity. Lesser-known riders drifted in and out of their company, some staying for only a single job. Underneath the ever-changing roster ran Cassidy's network of trails and contacts, and by the spring of 1900, that network began to turn its attention back toward the Union Pacific. The railroad's own changes shaped the choices that followed. After Wilcox, the company strengthened safes, added additional locks to express car doors, trained messengers to resist demands to open their cars, and experimented with escorting some trains with armed guards. Telegraph operators received instructions to repeat news of holdups instantly to division points, and division superintendents arranged for fast special trains that could carry deputies and detectives to the scene while robbers were still close. Those measures made robberies of small-way freights and lightly guarded locals more dangerous. The richest targets remained the limited trains carrying mail and express matter across the backbone of southern Wyoming. Yet those were also the trains the company fought hardest to protect. During the early summer, Cassidy and his scattered associates learned that Union Pacific Train No. 3, often referred to on timetables as an overland train, continued to carry large volumes of registered mail and express shipments on its westbound run between Cheyenne and Ogden. The train left Cheyenne late in the evening, climbed past Laramie, crossed the summit near the old town of Sherman, then dropped down through the country already scarred by the Wilcox holdup. From there it followed the broad basin of the Red Desert, touching small sidings with names such as Creston, Wamsutter, Red Desert, Tipton, and Table Rock before making its way toward the more settled ground near Green River and Rock Springs. Mail clerks sorted letters and parcels under hot lamps. Express messengers watched safes bolted to the floors of their cars, and passengers in the sleepers and coaches looked through dusty windows at miles of sagebrush and low hills. Information on that train did not come from a single source. Some of it arrived through public timetables posted in depots and newspapers. Some came through acquaintances who worked on the railroad and who understood how freight, bullion, and currency moved between banks in Omaha, Denver, and points farther west. Other pieces came through observation of the trains themselves. Men who rode legally as passengers between towns or who watched from section houses and small depots could count the cars in a consist, note where mail and express cars rode in relation to the locomotive, and estimate how many clerks and messengers were on duty in each car. In Denver, a different kind of information changing hands involved promises rather than schedules. Cassidy had come there to meet with men who claimed to speak for Union Pacific's management concerning his request for some kind of amnesty. He lodged in the city during the summer, moving with an ease that came from years of practice at blending with crowds. In Denver, he met close associates and rented rooms away from the rail yards and freight houses. A short walk away, the Brown Palace Hotel stood as a tall brick and stone symbol of the city's new wealth, its lobby and bar filled with ranchers, mine managers, and railroad officials who had no idea that some of the quiet men who passed them on the stairs had been linked to spectacular robberies in several states. During early July, a small group gathered in one of those Denver rooms. Among them were Cassidy, Longabaugh, and trusted riders who had proved themselves during earlier jobs. According to later accounts that drew on interviews and Pinkerton summaries, the men in that room examined recent newspaper reports and discussed the flow of cash and gold across the interior West. One plan centered on a bank in Winnemucca, Nevada, a town where large sums passed regularly through a single institution. The other focused on Union Pacific Train No. 3 and its westbound passage through the empty country west of Rawlins. By the time the meeting ended, the men who left the hotel district had carried away the outline of a campaign that would strike the railroad first, then the bank. That decision meant returning attention to the geography of the Red Desert. The country between Rawlins and Green River formed an elevated plain marked by shallow draws, low buttes, and long reaches of nearly level ground, broken only by the railroad grade and a telegraph line that followed it. Tipton Station, little more than a siding section house and small depot, building sat on that plain miles from any sizable settlement. Contemporary travelers who crossed the region on the later Lincoln Highway complained of a barren, sandy plain with no inhabitants apart from railroad workers and no buildings beyond those the railroad needed for its own purposes. And in 1900, the scene along the tracks differed only in the details of locomotive design and rolling stock. From a robber's perspective, that landscape offered both advantages and hazards. The lack of nearby towns meant few witnesses at the moment a train stopped, and the absence of trees or tall brush prevented hidden riflemen or sudden ambushes by local lawmen. At the same time, the same openness gave pursuers a wide view of any fleeing riders once the alarm had been raised, and the hard, dry ground held hoof prints and wheel tracks that could be followed by a skilled trailer. The telegraph line that paralleled the track guaranteed that a warning could reach Rawlins and Green River within minutes once a depot learned of trouble, and from those division points special trains could be sent with determination and speed. Selecting a precise point for a holdup demanded more than a mark on a timetable. The train would be moving upgrade as it pulled west from Tipton toward Table Rock, so any halt there would put additional strain on the locomotive and require longer to regain speed if the engineer survived and remained at the controls. The grade also limited the speed the train could reach in that stretch, making it easier for mounted men to keep up with the locomotive and for a flagman or masked rider to be seen by the engineer in time for him to stop before any obstruction on the track. Near the small station at Tipton, the ground offered shallow cuts and low ridges that could hide horses from casual view while still allowing a short ride to the main line. The men around Cassidy and Longabaugh understood from earlier experience that the escape route mattered as much as the holdup point. A robbery that yielded cash but left the gang cornered within a short ride of a depot or town would serve no purpose. For that reason, the area east and south of Tipton came under particular consideration. There, the terrain broke into low mounds and shallow drainages locals referred to as the haystacks, country that lay within reach of the tracks yet quickly carried a rider away from the straight line of the railroad grade. Trails from that country led southward toward Brown's Park and other familiar refuges, and within those open stretches of range, land relay strings of horses could wait without drawing the attention that a string of fresh animals would have drawn near a larger town. By late summer, preparations had moved from talk into action. Men loyal to the gang quietly acquired sticks of high-grade dynamite and the necessary blasting caps and fuses through suppliers who normally served mines and construction work. Others looked for horses with strong lungs and sound legs that could carry packs as well as saddles. A few riders moved through settlements along the Union Pacific line, buying supplies and watching the traffic of lawmen and railroad guards. In ranch country east and south of Tipton, helpers led horses to chosen spots in the haystacks country and rode away with instructions to say nothing unless questioned under oath. On the railroad side, division officers tried to read signs that something larger than ordinary rustling was taking shape. Pinkerton detectives and local sheriffs shared information at depots and in small-town hotels when their paths crossed. Telegraph operators noticed telegrams and long-distance telephone calls that mentioned familiar outlaw names, and some warnings moved along the line even when official instructions remained vague. Yet with no clear indication of when or where the next strike would fall, the most the company could do was keep train crews alert, repeat orders to resist opening express car doors, and increase the pace at which engines and cars equipped with stronger safes moved across Wyoming. Within that tightening web of preparation, individual men whose lives would cross in the Red Desert carried on their regular duties. Ernest Woodcock, the express messenger who had survived the earlier dynamiting of his car near Wilcox, remained with the company. Scars and lingering aches reminded him of the blast that had thrown him across his car and nearly killed him. Yet by 1900 he had returned to work guarding safes on westbound trains. Engineers moved their locomotives over the same desert grades day after day, memorizing curves, grades, and the feel of their engines. Conductors learned the faces of their regular passengers and the habits of the small stations under their charge. By the evening of August 28, 1900, the pieces of the coming collision had settled into place. Relay horses stood in the haystacks country. Dynamite rode in saddlebags and bedrolls. Men who had spoken in quiet hotel rooms in Denver waited in the open desert with scarves and masks ready. On the rails, Union Pacific Train Number 3 moved westward on its regular schedule, carrying mail clerks, passengers, and the express messenger who had already seen what dynamite could do to a rail car. The country between Tipton and Table Rock lay silent except for the constant wind. Before another day passed, the Red Desert would carry marks of violence that remained in the memories of the men who survived. In the late afternoon of August 29, 1900, the Union Pacific yards at Cheyenne worked under a steady clatter of iron on iron as crews made up westbound trains. Switch engines shoved strings of cars through crossovers while brakemen rode footboards and signaled with quick arm movements. Near one of the longer platforms, the consist for train number 3 stood nearly ready, its coaches already lined up behind the mail and express cars that would lead the run toward the Red Desert and beyond. Steam rose in slow bursts from the waiting road locomotive as the engineer and fireman inspected bearings and running gear in the last light of day. Inside the station building, passengers for the westbound run passed through the waiting room and stepped out to the platform with tickets in their hands and grips at their sides. Some had traveled long distances to reach this point, coming up from Denver or across from Omaha. Others had boarded earlier in the day at smaller towns along the line. Families with children, single men looking for work, mining agents, and well-dressed women bound for Salt Lake City or Ogden waited together in a loose line that shifted each time a baggage cart rattled past. None of them carried any thought of the stretch of track near Tipton where riders with dynamite and masks were already making their own preparations. The engine crew finished their checks as the call for boarding echoed down the platform. The engineer climbed into the cab and settled on his side of the narrow space where gauges, throttle, and brake valves sat within reach. The fireman stood beside the firebox door, sweat already marking his shirt from earlier work moving coal and checking flues. In front of them, the headlight waited dark, its glass clean and the reflector polished. Behind them, the tender held water and coal enough for the long pull up the grades west of Laramie and across the high country. The train that would follow included a mail car directly behind the tender, then the express car, another mail and baggage car, several coaches and one or two sleepers that would be filled by nightfall. Among the men who stepped through the side door of the express car that afternoon was Charles Woodcock, the Pacific Express Company messenger assigned to guard the safe and its contents. He had slept during the day in a boarding house near the yards, rising in time to eat a simple meal and walk to the depot with his valise and revolver in a plain leather holster. The scars from Wilcox remained, pale lines along his scalp and faint aches when the weather shifted, but he had resumed his regular duties with a determination that puzzled some of the clerks who knew his history. When he entered the car, he checked the heavy safe bolted to the floor, inspected locks on the side doors, and looked over the crates, packages, and sealed envelopes that would ride under his protection between Cheyenne and Green River. Farther back, postal clerks climbed into the mail cars with canvas pouches and leather bags. Their work began before the train moved. Each clerk had an assigned section of route and a set of cases with pigeonholes labeled for towns and railway post offices. As soon as they entered their narrow workspace, they hung bags on hooks, opened pouches from earlier runs, and began setting letters into slots according to destination. The air in the car held the smell of paper, ink, and canvas. Overhead, rows of lamps waited to be lit once daylight faded. The clerks knew that the hours after midnight would pass in a blur of hand motions and quick glances at postmarks. Conductor E.J. Kerrigan walked the length of the train before departure, checking that brake hoses were coupled, coach doors were latched, and passengers had taken their places. He carried a watch he trusted, a ticket punch, and a set of instructions from the division superintendent that reinforced the company's orders regarding express and mail security. The memory of Wilcox had reached every crew on this division. Kerrigan had heard the stories of dynamite under the doors of mail cars and the battered express messenger who had been hauled from the wreckage. Those accounts lived as warnings rather than excuses. He expected his crew to keep passengers calm in emergencies and to protect mail and express property as long as that duty did not turn the coaches behind him into rolling coffins. On the platform, the station agent took one last look down the line, satisfied himself that baggage and express shipments for train number 3 had been handled, and then gave the signal that the line was clear. The engineer answered with a short whistle and eased the throttle open. Wheels began to turn, couplers tightened in sequence from the head end to the rear. The coaches lurched and then settled into a steady motion as the locomotive led the consist out of Cheyenne and onto the main line. Passengers leaned to one side to watch the yards slide past, then straightened as the train pointed toward open country. Inside the express car, Woodcox slid the side doors shut and locked them with practiced motions. He checked the hinges, satisfied himself that the bars in their sockets locked firmly, and then glanced at the safe once more. Company rules required him to keep the safe closed during movement and to open it only when working under controlled conditions. The combination remained in his head, not on paper. He knew that any robber who wanted the contents would need either his cooperation or enough blasting powder to wreck the car. Both options carried dangers that he had already measured once in his life. As the train climbed past small settlements west of Cheyenne, dusk settled over the plains. The fireman opened the firebox door and swung his shovel in a steady rhythm, feeding coal to keep boiler pressure within the range the engineer wanted. Glow from the fire brushed their faces each time the door opened, then vanished when it clanged shut. Outside, a wind carried dust against the sides of the cars. In the coaches, passengers adjusted window shades, shared newspapers, and opened small parcels of food. Lamps along the aisle cast narrow pools of light on each seat. In one coach, a traveling salesman laid his sample cases on the overhead rack and polished his spectacles with a handkerchief before lighting a cigar. Across the aisle, a pair of young cowhands returning from a brief trip to town tipped their hats low and tried to sleep with their boots braced against the seat in front of them. Near the rear, a woman in a dark dress kept her gloved hands folded in her lap while she watched two children seated across from her share a paper bag of sweets. The rhythm of rail joints under their feet formed a constant background sound that eased some nerves and irritated others. Kerrigan passed through each car, collecting tickets and making simple conversation where it seemed helpful. He noted a few passengers who appeared nervous in the presence of railroad officers but saw no direct cause for concern. Travelers who carried large sums or valuable goods often tried to appear calm and failed. In this case, most of the wealth on the train rode in sealed pouches, crates, and strongboxes near the head end, rather than in the suitcases and trunks in the baggage car. When he finished checking the sleepers and coaches, he paused in the vestibule to feel the steady pull of the grade and listen for any unusual sounds from the trucks beneath him. Beyond Laramie, the line curved through higher country where nights turned cold even in late summer. Steam rose in thicker clouds from the locomotive, and the firemen worked harder to meet the demands of the grade. Passengers pulled blankets from berths and adjusted collars. The clerks in the mail cars lit their lamps and went on with their sorting, their hands moving constantly as they transferred letters from canvas pouches to labeled cases. Every station between Cheyenne and Ogden depended on their accuracy. Errors made in these cars could send a letter hundreds of miles from its intended destination. Woodcock felt each change in grade and each curve as a shift in the sway of his car. He stacked small parcels more securely near the walls, set his shotgun within reach, and checked his revolver once more. The company did not require him to carry a long arm, but many messengers did so by choice. In his case, the barrel and stock of the shotgun carried memories as well as shot. When he had recovered enough from his earlier injuries to work again, he had made a habit of keeping the weapon close during every run. It represented one more layer between the safe and hands that tried to force it open. As the evening deepened into a darker hour, the train crossed the country east of Rawlins. Inside the depot there, a telegrapher received and sent messages concerning freight, engine assignments, and routine operations. He also watched for any warnings from special agents regarding strangers in town or unusual movements along the tracks. On that particular night, no extraordinary message crossed his desk. Train number 3 received its orders and continued west on a schedule that looked ordinary in every line. Rawlins marked a change in the passenger list. Some people whose journeys ended there stepped down with their bags and disappeared into the lamplight of the platform. Others boarded, filling seats recently vacated. A cattle buyer with a narrow beard took a place near the center of one coach and unfolded a newspaper printed earlier in the day. A pair of track workers heading to Green River climbed into another car, carrying lunch pails and heavy gloves. To each of them, the ride toward Tipton and Table Rock promised nothing more than a few hours of sleep or conversation before dawn. Once the stops near Rawlins fell behind, the country opened into the higher, sparser ground that railroad men called the Red Desert. The land around the right-of-way held low sagebrush, scattered outcrops, and long, bare ridges with little shelter. From the cab, the headlight reached only a limited distance, and the engineer depended on his knowledge of the timetable, the mileposts, and the grade profile to anticipate each curve and rise. The air grew cooler, and the sky above the thin line of smoke carried the faint glow of distant stars that the crew glimpsed when they leaned from the cab windows. Inside the sleepers, porters moved quietly along the aisle, making sure curtains hung properly and that passengers who had paid for berths had the blankets and pillows that went with them. Some of the men and women in those compartments would have recognized names such as Butch Cassidy and Kid Curry from recent newspaper accounts if anyone had raised the subject. None of them had any reason to think that the men who had robbed trains near Wilcox and elsewhere were close to the same line of track on which they now slept. In the mail car nearest the tender, the rocking of the train grew more pronounced as the locomotive worked harder on the grade west of Tipton. Clerks braced their feet wider and leaned slightly into each curve as they continued their pattern of opening pouches, canceling stamps, and feeding letters into labeled slots. From time to time, one of them glanced at the clock bolted to the bulkhead and calculated which station lay ahead. Their jobs depended on meeting distribution points at the right moment. Delays could ripple outward into missed connections all along the route. Woodcock paused in his own routine to pour coffee from a small pot he kept on a warming plate near his desk. The drink held the bitterness of strong brew steeped for long minutes, yet it helped keep his eyes clear and his thoughts steady. He looked at the closed safe, studied the steel hinges and thick door, and reminded himself that his first duty was not only to guard the contents but also to survive every run if possible. After earlier experience, he understood that dynamite could turn any car into a cloud of splinters. The rules written in company offices did not change that fact, and neither did the quiet hum of the wheels beneath him. In the coaches, conversation thinned as more passengers tried to rest. The salesman who had lit a cigar earlier now dozed with his chin on his chest, the stub of his smoke crushed in an ashtray beside him. The cowhands shifted positions without waking fully, the motion of the train blending into their dreams. Children in the care of their mother near the rear seat of another coach slept against her sides. She watched the dim corridor and listened to the distant sounds that came through the car walls, trusting that the railroad men whose uniforms she had seen earlier would handle any difficulty. Kerrigan moved through the train once more, speaking quietly with brakemen and porters to confirm that all routine tasks had been completed after the last stop. He felt the pull of the grade in the way his body leaned slightly toward the rear of the train as he walked forward. When he stepped onto the platform between the leading coach and the mail car, he paused for a moment to breathe the cooler air and assess the condition of the train. The couplings held tight. The brake hose connections looked secure. There was no immediate sign of trouble. From his vantage point, he could see only a short section of track ahead in the faint reflection of the headlight against the rails. Beyond that narrow zone, the darkness of the desert swallowed the line completely. He understood that somewhere in that direction lay Tipton and the small section house where a handful of railroad workers lived. There would be no crowd on the platform when number 3 reached that remote point. Only the station agent and perhaps a few yard hands. It looked like one more ordinary night job. In the cab, the engineer kept his eyes on the rails and the faint outline of the telegraph poles that marched along the line. The fireman watched the water glass and pressure gauge, ready to add coal or adjust the injector as needed. Both men felt the familiar tension of running through lonely country late at night, a tension sharpened by memories of Wilcox and other holdups along western lines. They knew that a lantern swung at the wrong place, a pile of ties laid across the rails, or a figure dropping into the cab could turn an uneventful run into a violent struggle with no warning. Yet as train number 3 rolled westward past Tipton and toward the rise that led to Table Rock, there was nothing in the motion of the wheels or the sound of the wind that foretold the minutes to come. Inside the cars, passengers slept or stared through glass at a darkness that revealed little. Clerks sorted mail. Woodcock checked the bars on his doors and the shotgun in his rack. Kerrigan finished his inspection round and prepared to step forward once more if the train slowed in any place that did not match his orders. On that stretch of track for a brief interval, every person moved within patterns that felt like normal duty. The riders waiting beyond the edge of the headlight's reach had already decided that those patterns would break before the run reached Green River. When the sun dropped behind the low line of hills north of the tracks on August 29, 1900, Union Pacific Train Number 3 had already taken water at Tipton and begun the climb toward Table Rock. The desert air cooled quickly, and the headlight cut a narrow cone across the ballast and rails. In the cab, the engineer watched the grade and the distant outline of the telegraph poles while his fireman swung the shovel in a practiced arc, feeding coal to keep steam pressure where it needed to be for the long pull. Both men had made this climb many times. They knew every curve and milepost, and they expected nothing more unusual than a wind gust or a stray cow near a fence line. Behind the tender coal lay heaped in a dark mass, its surface uneven from earlier work with the scoop. Neither man looked back there as the locomotive settled into its rhythm. The noise of exhaust, the ringing of metal, and the rush of air past the cab sides formed a wall of sound that masked smaller noises. At some point after the train cleared Tipton, a man who had ridden out of sight on the rear deck of the tender pulled himself over the coal and eased down toward the faint glow from the firebox door. The first sign the crew had that they were no longer alone came when a boot heel scraped metal behind them. The engineer turned his head and saw a figure dropping into the cab from the tender, face covered with a cloth mask that left only the eyes visible. In one hand, the intruder held a heavy revolver. The barrel pointed steadily at the engineer's midsection. The man's hat brim shaded his eyes, but his voice carried clearly over the engine noise when he spoke. He told the engineer that a fire burned beside the track ahead, and that the train would stop when the flame came into view, with no argument and no questions. The engineer knew the stories from Wilcox and other holdups. He also knew the grade and the weight behind him. A man with a revolver inches from his body left little room for debate. He kept one hand on the throttle and the other near the air brake valve, watching the night ahead for any flicker that matched the description. The fireman, his shovel suddenly idle, stood stiff against his side of the cab, eyes moving from the masked face to the pistol and back again. He understood that any sudden move toward the scoop or the firebox door could be read as an attempt to resist. For a short interval, the only change came in the shadows the headlight threw across the right-of-way. Sagebrush and low rocks passed in a steady pattern. Then on the fireman's side, a patch of light appeared a short distance from the rails. A small pile of wood or brush burned there, flames whipping sideways when the wind gusted. The masked man told the engineer to shut off steam and use the brakes. The order carried no heat, only flat insistence. The engineer closed the throttle, eased the brake valve over, and felt the resistance as the train began to slow on, the grade. As the locomotive approached the burning pile, 3 riders appeared near the light. Each man wore a cloth mask and carried a rifle or shotgun held ready across his saddle. One stepped close enough to touch the side of the cab and shouted up to ask whether the orders had been obeyed. The masked man in the cab answered that the crew had done as told. The other riders spread out slightly, placing themselves where they could cover the engine and the head end of the train as the cars ground to a halt on the slight incline. Farther back, the tremor of the brakes ran through the length of the consist. Sleeping passengers felt the motion change and stirred in their berths. In the coaches, men and women who had been half awake straightened in their seats and looked toward the front, seeing only darkness beyond the windows. Lamps swung on their hooks as the slack ran out. No one in the rear cars could see the masked men at the head end, but the unusual stop on open desert ground triggered the same uneasy questions that had followed other sudden halts in lonely country during recent years of robberies. Once the train stood still, conductor E.J. Kerrigan stepped down from one of the forward coaches with his lantern. His responsibility included understanding every delay, and an unscheduled stop on a grade demanded explanation. He walked along the ballast toward the engine, the lantern's light circling his boots until the beam from the headlight picked out his figure. A rifle barrel swung in his direction. A masked rider told him to stop right there. Kerrigan took in the scene quickly. A masked man stood near the cylinder head on his side of the locomotive. Another sat his horse opposite. A third remained near the burning pile, eyes on the line of cars. In the cab, a fourth figure stood between the crewmen, revolver angled toward the engineer. With that picture in mind, Kerrigan asked why his train had been stopped. The answer came as a hard command. He was to uncouple the mail and express cars from the coaches and sleepers, leaving only those head-end cars attached to the locomotive. Rather than move straight to the couplers, Kerrigan mounted the platform of the first coach. He knew the grade. If he simply pulled the pin and let the engine move off, the cars full of passengers behind him would have little to hold them in place. Without brakes set, the cars could roll backward down the hill, picking up speed until they piled up or left the rails. When the order to uncouple was repeated with sharper emphasis, he explained that fact in level terms, pointing toward the rear and naming the hazard. The man below him listened long enough to understand, then granted a narrow concession. Kerrigan could set the brakes on the passenger cars, but he was to move quickly and keep his hands away from any weapons. He took that small opening and stepped into the coach. Inside, he told the passengers in low, direct words that the train had been stopped by armed men, and that he needed to set the brakes to keep the coaches from rolling. He directed everyone to stay inside, keep low, and avoid the windows. In each car, he moved down the length, turning the brake wheels until he felt the shoes bite. In one car, an older man in a dark suit ignored the warning and lifted the shade to look outside. Kerrigan saw the movement from the corner of his eye and started toward him, but a flash from near the head end came first. A bullet shattered glass close enough to the man's face to cut his skin with splinters. The shade dropped again as the passenger fell back into his seat, shocked into silence. Kerrigan used that moment to reinforce his instructions, making clear that any head at a window gave the gunman an excuse to fire. When he had worked his way through the forward coaches, feeling each brake wheel tighten, he returned to the head of the train. The masked rider still waited near the coupler between the baggage section and the first coach, rifle held at a relaxed but ready angle. Under that gaze, Kerrigan bent to the coupling. The lantern light showed him the pin in the heavy iron that joined car to car. He pulled the pin clear, felt the slack ease, and stepped quickly away as the slight separation appeared. The coaches now stood locked in place by their own brakes, while the locomotive and the two head-end cars stood free. The man in the cab ordered the engineer to move forward. With the grade still climbing, the locomotive strained, but the reduced load made the work manageable. The tender, the first mail car, and the express car crept away from the rest of the train. Passengers felt the brief tug, then the release as the forward section moved off, leaving their cars standing still in the desert night. Some prayed quietly. Others clenched fists around armrests. A few tried to peer through cracks in curtains without drawing attention. The engine rolled a short distance up the grade until one of the riders signaled for another stop. The headlight shone now on an empty stretch of track edged by low banks of sand and scattered brush. No station house or section crew stood nearby. It was a place selected for isolation, with no shelter for passengers and no ready help for crew. Here the train halted again. One bandit took station near the engine with his revolver aimed casually at the engineer and fireman, instructing them to stay in the cab and make no attempt to reverse or blow a warning signal. The other men went to the side of the express car. Inside, Charles Woodcock had felt every lurch since the first halt. He knew the difference between a routine stop at a siding and the deliberate separation that had just taken place. When the locomotive pulled away with only the head-end cars, he stepped to the door and made sure both bars sat firmly in their sockets. He checked the locks, then lifted his shotgun from its bracket and thumbed back both hammers. The safe, bolted to the car floor and packed with consignments, stood behind him. He kept his body between that steel box and the doors. Voices reached him from outside. A man called for him by title, telling the messenger to open up. The tone carried an edge that matched many earlier robberies along Western lines. Woodcock answered through the planking, refusing to draw the bars or turn the key. Company duty and personal pride lined up in that refusal. He had already once been battered nearly senseless when dynamite tore through an express car under his watch. This time he intended to make the men outside work for every inch. The outlaws conferred in low tones. One suggested blowing the doors from their hinges. Another reminded him that any explosion big enough to tear open the end of the car might kill the messenger and wreck the shipment so thoroughly that nothing useful remained. The narrow desert wind carried only fragments of their discussion, but the anger in some phrases carried clear. They understood that the man inside knew his job, and that he had already shown a willingness to absorb punishment rather than give up his safe. Kerrigan stood nearby under guard, watching the exchange. The masked man covering him spoke just loudly enough for the conductor to hear that they wanted the express safe, not the passengers and not the mail. If they had to blow the car to pieces to reach it, they would, and whatever happened to Woodcock would be counted as his own choice. Kerrigan pictured the earlier wrecked mail and express cars he had heard described after Wilcox. He could imagine all too clearly what a full charge would do to a car in which a man stood only a few feet from the door. The guard ordered Kerrigan forward, closer to the express car door. He yelled for Woodcock by name, telling him that the men outside had dynamite ready. He urged the messenger to open the doors and step aside, arguing that no job could justify being torn to pieces on a lonely stretch of track. For a moment there was no reply. Then Woodcock's voice came through the planks, tight and strained. He asked what stood between him and a bullet the instant he lifted the bars. Kerrigan answered as plainly as he could. The robbers had made it clear they wanted what lay in the safe. Killing him would only complicate their work and bring heavier pursuit. If he stayed behind the locked doors, they would treat the entire car as a target and pack enough explosive near the hinges to shred everything inside. He reminded Woodcock that they had already moved the passengers away, that the crew stood under guns and that no help could reach them before the men outside decided how much force to use. Inside the car, Woodcock weighed his choices with the safe at his back and the dark stretch of desert outside. He had sworn to defend the express company's property. He had also already seen how thin the line between duty and death could become when dynamite entered the equation. The earlier blast near Wilcox had left him deaf and bleeding on his own floor. Another such explosion at close range might finish what the first had begun. The voices outside pressed him. One of the masked men raised his tone, counting down in slow, harsh numbers, promising to rip the car open if the doors remained shut when he reached the end of that count. Kerrigan spoke over him, repeating his plea. The guard's revolver remained fixed on the conductor's chest, making it clear that any move backward would bring a shot. The engineer and fireman watched from the cab, helpless, seeing only shadows and lantern light. At the last moment, Woodcock relented. Metal scraped as he slid the first bar back. The second followed with a dull clank. He turned the key in the lock with stiff fingers, stepped away from the doorway, and kept the shotgun in his hands but pointed toward the floor. The door swung open a narrow span, revealing his figure in the lamplight. Two masked men surged into the gap, their revolvers trained on his chest. One ordered him to stand against the car wall with his hands visible. The other scanned the interior, locating the safe and the scattered parcels. With the messenger pinned in place and the crew under guard outside, the robbers turned their attention to the steel box on the floor. They examined the hinges and the dial, asked Woodcock for the combination, and received only silence and a hard stare in response. One man knelt to inspect the gap between the safe and the wood, measuring it with his fingers. Then he straightened and called for the explosives. Sticks of powder, fuses, and caps came into the car in careful hands. They began laying the first charge against the safe door, packing scrap wood and mail sacks around it in an effort to direct the force inward. Outside, Kerrigan watched the process through the open doorway. He saw the men set fuses, crimp caps, and tuck the loose ends in place. He recognized the same method that had turned earlier cars into wreckage and knew that the next few minutes would decide whether his messenger walked away again, or whether he would be carried out on a door torn from its hinges. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the sharp smell of powder to the engine in the mail car. In that narrow stretch of desert, every breath, every creak of wood, and every small sound of metal on metal came into sharp relief, while the men inside the express car readied the blast that would decide how rich the robbers would leave and how damaged the train would be once the smoke cleared. The men inside the express car finished tamping loose boards and torn mail sacks around the sticks of powder and stepped back from the steel face of the safe. One of them pressed each charge with his palm to make sure the fuses could not shift. Another checked the length of each fuse by touch, counting the inches between the cap and the point where a match would touch. When they were satisfied, they herded Charles Woodcock and the other railroad men farther from the doorway, pushing them toward the front corner of the car where splintered crates still blocked part of the view. A single gunman stayed with the prisoners, revolver level, while his partners stepped outside with coils of fuse trailing from the door. Out on the ballast, the night carried every sound with sharp edges. The engineer and fireman watched from the cab steps while the bandits laid the free ends of the fuses on the ground where lantern light reached them. Conductor E.J. Kerrigan stood a short distance from the open doorway, close enough to see the pale gray rope of each fuse as it curled over the threshold. The guard covering him ordered him to hold his place and keep his hands where they could be seen. When one of the dynamite men struck a match, the flame flared bright against his knuckles before he touched it and turned to each fuse. As soon as the burning ends hissed, all the masked men outside moved back from the car. They shouted at Woodcock and the other prisoners to get down. Inside the car, the guard grabbed the messenger by the shoulder and dragged him toward the floor, forcing him to lie face down between two broken boxes. Kerrigan dropped to one knee on the trackside cinders, teeth tight, eyes fixed on the open doorway. The engineer crouched on the gangway between cab and tender, feeling the rough steel under his hands as he waited for the shock. The first detonation came as a hard, close blow that turned air into a solid force. The floor jumped under Woodcock's chest. Nails shrieked from timbers. The sheet iron of the car sides flexed and popped. A dense pressure swept through the compartment, filling ears and sinuses and driving breath from lungs. Splinters and fragments of crate boards rattled across the interior like thrown gravel. Smoke rolled outward through the door and burst seams, mixing with the coal smoke from the engine stack until the air around the head end felt thick enough to grip. When the worst of the concussion passed, the gunman in charge of the prisoners pushed himself up first and dragged Woodcock to his knees. Both men coughed in the heavy dust. Lantern light inside the car had been shattered, leaving only the glow from the open door and the weak spill from the headlight. In that dimness, the outlines of the safe stayed hard and solid in front of him. The steel door still sat tight within its frame. The hinges had not sprung. The charges had torn at the planks around the safe, but had not yet broken the lock that mattered. The dynamite men came, back into the car with more sticks in their hands and irritation in their voices. They pushed aside broken boards with their boots and inspected the safe at close range. The paint on the door had blistered near the lock and a shallow dent marked the area where the first blast had struck hardest, yet the heavy metal still held. They laid fresh charges in closer contact with the edge of the door, wedging sticks into every gap that remained between the safe and the fractured planking. One of them scooped torn mail sacks into a tight bundle against the powder, using the canvas as packing to drive the force inward. Outside, Kerrigan heard them shout for the fuses again. The engineer saw movement near the doorway as fresh cords were dragged out and laid over the sill. The same man who had lit the first set struck another match, his hand cupped, and fed flame to each blackened tip. Hissing began again. The outlaws stepped back to the same safe distance and threw themselves flat. The second explosion hit with a deeper tone and a longer roll. This time the car roof lifted and came down with a loud bang that rang along the frame. One side of the express car bulged outward, glass shattered in a spray from the small windows. The safe shifted on its bolted feet, leaving marks on the boards beneath it, and something inside the lock mechanism gave way with a heavy metallic crack that Woodcock felt more than heard. For several moments, no one moved. Dust turned the air inside the car into a choking cloud. Small pieces of wood and iron pattered down from the ceiling and bounced from shoulders and backs. The guard who had been closest to the prisoners lay on his side with his hat blown off and his mask askew. Woodcock's ears rang so loudly that the shouted questions of the other bandits came through as distant, muffled sounds. He pushed himself upright with effort, palms slipping on the grit that now coated the floor. Blood ran from a fresh cut along his forearm where a splinter had torn his sleeve. Kerrigan, still half crouched outside, wiped grit from his eyes and forced himself to look through the doorway. He could see that the safe had changed position and that a jagged line now crossed the area near the handle. The dynamite man clambered back into the car again, more cautiously this time, and hammered the safe door with the heel of his hand. It stayed shut. The lock had weakened, but the seam had not yet opened enough to give access. He stepped back with a curse and demanded another stick. The supply had been laid ready near the car for exactly this contingency. A single remaining charge would have to finish what the first two had begun. For the third attempt, they pressed the powder directly against the door seam and braced it with a wedge of crate timber cut for the purpose. The fuse ran only a short distance. Once again, the bandits shouted for everyone to lie flat. The guard shoved Woodcock down so hard that his cheek struck the edge of a board. Outside, the engineer dropped to his belly on the steel of the gangway. Kerrigan flattened himself against the slope of the ballast, one arm over his head. The last blast came with a sharp crack that shook the short string of cars and sent a brief wave through the couplers. It lacked the drawn-out roar of the second charge, but concentrated its force on the armored door. A heavy thud followed as the safe face sprang outward and struck the nearest wall of the car. One hinge tore loose completely, the other bent and twisted. Currency packs, paper envelopes, and small wooden boxes tumbled from the torn opening and scattered across the wrecked floor. Within the car, the damage reached nearly every surface. Sections of the roof sagged where supports had splintered. At least one side panel had torn away from its frame and now hung at an angle that exposed the interior to the desert night. Boards lay broken underfoot. Fragments of metal from the safe and its fittings lay mixed with pieces of shingle, glass, and parcel wrapping. The rear door hung crooked, its upper hinge torn from the jam. Yet the frame of the car still stood on its trucks, and the floor, though torn, had not collapsed. Woodcock rolled onto his back and drew breath in ragged pulls. The third explosion had left his ears numb and his jaw aching, but he remained conscious. His shirt and coat bore black smears and fresh rips where shrapnel had grazed the fabric. When he pressed a hand to his head, his fingers came away gritty yet not soaked in blood. After the beating he had taken inside another express car near Wilcox, the absence of a skull wound felt unreal. The guard hauled him upright again and shoved him against the least damaged section of wall while the other bandits crowded around the broken safe. Kerrigan stood slowly, legs stiff, and joined the engineer and fireman near the doorway under the eye of the man detailed to keep them covered. Inside, the outlaws moved quickly, gathering packets and boxes from the open cavity. They tossed small bundles of notes into flour sacks, followed them with cloth-wrapped parcels, and then reached for the stacks of small wooden containers stamped with the names of watch companies and jewelers. Nails squeaked as lids were pried off. The brass gleam of unfinished watch movements and cases showed in the lantern glare. The men packed the watches carefully, aware that crushed movements would lose value. They stacked cases together and wrapped them in fragments of blanket before slipping them into saddlebags waiting on the floor. Loose coins and smaller items went into pockets or the corners of bags already half filled. They worked with the speed of men who had rehearsed this process many times in camps where no one could see them. The only pause came when one bandit straightened, stared at the diminishing contents of the safe, and muttered in clear frustration that there was less paper money than expected. Later statements by company officials and investigators fixed the railway's admitted cash loss at $50.40, an amount that contrasted sharply with later writers who spoke of a far larger haul. Whatever the precise figure in notes and coin, the immediate scene in the express car showed a floor crowded with watch movements, cases, and scattered shipping materials. For the bandits, those items represented portable value that could be sold to fences and dishonest jewelers who asked few questions. For the railroad and express company, they represented both loss and proof that even improved safes could be forced with enough explosive and will. Once the last usable article had been pulled from the safe cavity, one robber stepped out of the car and signaled toward the darkness beyond the small circle of light around the train. From the open desert came the thud of hooves. Fresh horses that had been held back away from the noise approached at a trot, led by a man who had remained with them during the work on the car. The animals snorted at the smell of powder and hot metal as they neared the wreckage. Saddlebags already hung across their backs, cinch straps tight, reins looped over their necks. Before mounting, one of the bandits turned to Kerrigan and asked the time. The conductor raised his hand slowly to his vest pocket, drew out his watch, and flicked open the case under the guard's stare. The dial showed the delay that the robbery had already imposed on the schedule. He read off the hour and minutes plainly. Then, recognizing the smallness of the gesture yet seeing no better offering, he extended the watch toward the man as if to surrender it along with the contents of the safe. The reply took him by surprise. The bandit told him to keep the timepiece, adding that they did not intend to take personal property from men working the train. The contrast between that line and the violence just inflicted on the express car hung in the air for a moment. Wilcox, still pressed against the inside wall, heard the words through the ringing in his ears and understood that his own pocket watch sat in a different category in the robbers' minds than the shipment in the safe. That distinction would not save his belongings. As the outlaws moved to leave the car, one of them reached out, stripped the messenger's watch from its chain, and pocketed it without ceremony. With the safe emptied and the prisoners disarmed and shaken, the gang shifted its attention fully to departure. They ordered the engineer, fireman, conductor, mail clerks, and express messenger to stay close together near the locomotive. The guard with the revolver backed toward his horse, never turning his eyes from the clustered railroad men. As soon as he reached the stirrup, he swung into the saddle and wheeled his animal away from the tracks. The others followed, fastening saddlebags and checking cinches with quick, practiced motions. Lantern light picked out the outlines of their bandana masks in the dark, shapes of their hats. Powder stains marked some of their coat sleeves. When the last man had settled into place, the group formed a loose file that angled away from the head end, heading toward the open ground south of the line where relay mounts and hiding places waited beyond the limited reach of the headlight. For several heartbeats after the riders left the immediate circle of light, the only sounds at the front of the train came from the soft hiss of steam and the occasional clink of cooling metal in the wrecked car. The smell of burnt powder and singed wood lingered over everything. Wilcox stood among the crew, clothing torn, face blackened, his safe ruined, his watch gone, and his life intact. Kerrigan looked from the broken express car to the shadows where the bandits had vanished and counted off in his mind the tasks that now fell to him and his men. The robbery had ended at the tracks, yet its consequences had only begun to unroll across the telegraph lines, the railroad offices, and the wide stretch of country toward which the riders had turned their horses. The riders who had emptied the express safe did not look back toward the train as they left the hard glare of the headlight. Their horses picked up speed once they reached open ground, hooves thudding on the packed soil between clumps of sage. Each man carried bulging saddlebags that swung against the animal's flanks. The weight came from watch movements, cases, and a small amount of cash, all taken in minutes from the wrecked car. Powder smoke still clung to their coats. In the dark, clear air, the only sign they left behind was a faint cloud of dust and the line of tracks that led away from the halted train. The route had been chosen in advance. From the rails near Table Rock, it led eastward across broken country toward a low formation of sandstone outcrops known locally as the Haystacks. There, extra horses waited behind a rise where no passing crewman or section hand could see them from the line. The gang had left those animals with a single hand earlier in the day after circling far around any settlement. Now, with the robbery finished, they rode toward that point in a loose file that allowed each man space to move if a mount stumbled. When they reached the Haystacks, the horses that had brought them from the track stood blowing and damp. The relay animals, rested and alert, shifted and tossed their heads as the masked men approached. None of the outlaws spent time talking. They swung down, stripped loaded bags from sweaty saddles, and slung them over the fresh horses. Cinches were checked by touch, not sight. In only a few minutes, the gang sat mounted again on animals that could carry them through the night at a sustained pace. The discarded horses were turned loose to wander. Their meandering tracks would give any pursuers one more set of signs to sort from the ground. From the relay point, the outlaws pushed south and east, riding toward country they knew well. The land opened into a series of shallow draws and low ridges that offered cover from distant eyes. Small water holes and short stretches of creek had been marked and remembered over earlier years of cattle work and hiding. At each rise, the riders checked the horizon. No lantern showed behind them. No cluster of moving lights marked a pursuit train stopped at the scene of the robbery. For the moment, distance and darkness shielded them. Back at the train, Engineer Henry Wallenstein and the firemen, still unsteady from the holdup and the blasts, had their own tasks. As soon as the last rider disappeared into the night, they moved cautiously toward the express car with conductor E.J. Kerrigan and the mail clerks. They needed to know whether the car could travel and whether any lingering fire might spread from torn planking to the roof or the mail sacks. The air inside still held the acrid smell of burned powder and scorched paint. Lantern light showed splintered boards, sagging metal, and papers scattered in drifts. Kerrigan and the clerks searched for sparks and glowing fragments. Every corner of the car was checked, every heap of torn mail shifted with boot or gloved hand. They found no open flame, only embers embedded in damaged timber near the safe. Those were stamped out and doused with water from buckets kept in the car for emergencies. The floor, though torn and bent, still carried weight. The truck sat square on the rails. With the safe wrecked but no fire running, the head end could still move under its own power. The crew stepped back down onto the ballast. They knew passengers waited in the coaches on the grade behind them, brakes set tight, windows darkened by drawn shades. Those people had heard blasts and gunfire without knowing the result. It fell to Kerrigan and Wallenstein to bring the train together and move it to a point where help existed. They conferred briefly, deciding that the quickest way to reach the nearest division point at Green River was to proceed west rather than backing down the hill for miles. The open track ahead promised fewer complications than a long reverse pull in the dark. Under Kerrigan's direction, the engineer eased the locomotive and the two damaged cars back along the rails until the coupler on the express car lined up with the front coach. Men on the ground watched the gap close. At the signal, Wallenstein set the air and nudged the throttle. The couplers met with a metallic clank and locked. Kerrigan moved along the side, checking that each connection held and that no brake lines had been broken in the holdup. Once satisfied, he climbed back aboard and walked through the forward coaches, speaking plainly to the passengers. His message did not hide what had occurred. He told them armed men had stopped the train, separated the head end, and forced open the express safe. No passenger had been taken or wounded. The danger from gunfire and dynamite had passed for the moment. The cars would stay on the rails and move west to Green River, where authorities could take charge. He instructed everyone to remain seated, keep shades drawn, and avoid crowding the aisles as the train started. Murmurs ran through each car as people absorbed the news. Some prayed. Others gripped seats or family members' hands. When Kerrigan reached the front, Wallenstein gave a final glance at the gauge and eased the throttle forward. Steam flowed to the cylinders. The locomotive pulled against the heavy line of cars, gaining slow momentum on the grade. Behind the tender, the express car creaked in protest but rolled. The shattered safe and broken planking rattled, yet did not drop anything onto the roadbed. The train that had been a stationary target for masked men now moved again, its headlight cutting a narrow path west into the empty land. The journey to Green River felt longer than the timetable distance. The crew watched each milepost and every bend in the track, half expecting to see another signal fire or obstruction. None appeared. Telegraph poles and fence posts slid past in steady order. The cab's routine sounds, which earlier in the night had marked normalcy, now carried a new edge. Each change in the rhythm of the engine suggested a hidden threat, until it proved to be only the grade or the wind. In the coaches, passengers traded whispered versions of what they had heard or glimpsed. Those who had seen the masked men through narrow gaps in shades described pistols, rifles, and bandana masks. Others who had only heard the blasts imagined scenes more violent than the facts, yet every account reflected the same truth, that the routine of the journey had been broken by organized armed force. Children cried and then fell asleep from exhaustion. Older travelers sat rigid, listening for any sign that the ordeal might resume. 2 hours behind schedule, the train reached Green River in the early morning hours of August 30th. Lamps burned in the depot and in nearby section houses. Railroad men on duty saw at once that something was wrong. The express car bore scars that no weather or normal wear could produce. One side panel bulged outward. A window hung broken. Soot and smoke marks streaked the roof. When the train stopped at the platform, Kerrigan stepped down first and called for the station agent. His voice carried the clipped urgency of a man who had held himself steady for as long as the job required and now had news that had to reach beyond the yard. Inside the depot office, the agent swung the telegraph key toward Kerrigan and asked for the whole story in the order it needed to be wired. Together they shaped a message that told the basic facts. Train number 3 held up west of Tipton. Express car wrecked by explosives. Robbers escaped on horseback with valuables, crew, and passengers alive. The wire clicked and snapped as the report went out along the line to division headquarters and to Union Pacific offices farther east. Copies followed for the express company and for law officers. At almost the same moment, word began to spread along the wooden platform and into town. Railroad men repeated fragments of the account to each other as they saw the damage. A brakeman pointed out gaps in the express car siding to a shopman who had just walked up from the yard. Another worker stared at the warped safe door inside and shook his head. Stories of the Wilcox robbery had never fully faded. Now here was fresh evidence that the same pattern had returned to Wyoming rails. In Omaha and other points where the Union Pacific and the Express Company directed their business, managers received the telegrams and reacted with speed. Sharpened by the memory of earlier losses, orders went out to special agents and to division superintendents along the line. Every available detective and trusted local peace officer was to turn attention toward the new crime. Descriptions of the robbers, drawn from the statements of Kerrigan, Woodcock, and others on the train, were assembled and transmitted. Height, build, clothing, and the particular way each man had spoken or moved were all noted. United States Marshal Frank Hadsell, already experienced with Western outlaws, received the news through his own channels. In Carbon County, Sheriff Creed McDaniel learned of the holdup and began laying plans for a posse. In Sweetwater County, Sheriff Peter Swanson did the same. Each man knew the country between the Union Pacific line and the Colorado and Utah borders, with its cuts, draws, and scattered ranches that offered water and temporary shelter. They also knew the reputation of the group now blamed for the crime, a loose organization of hard riders and gunmen who had already shown at Wilcox and other places that they did not shy from gun smoke. Telegraph keys in Rawlins, Rock Springs, Green River, and smaller stations tapped steadily through the rest of the night. Messages flew back and forth carrying reports of riders seen near section houses, strangers asking questions in small settlements, and horses missing from ranch corrals. The information was fragmentary and sometimes wrong, yet every small piece received attention. Lawmen had learned from the Wilcox affair that delay could give a train robber gang enough time to vanish into the most broken country the region offered. This time they intended to close the gap as quickly as horses, rail cars, and wires would allow. By daybreak on August 30th, the first organized response had begun to take physical shape. In Rawlins, McDaniel gathered men who knew how to ride long miles without supervision, men who could read tracks in dry country and who carried rifles they trusted. Among them stood Deputy Joe LaForce, already building his own reputation as a determined tracker. They loaded saddles, bedrolls, and provisions into a baggage car attached to a short train that would carry them toward the scene of the holdup. In Sweetwater County, Swanson pulled together his own group, drawing on ranch hands and townsmen with a stake in keeping the line clear of repeat attacks. Some of these volunteers had seen what had happened to the express cars at Wilcox, or knew men who had. Others understood that every robbery drove up insurance rates and brought heavier scrutiny to the region. They saddled up and headed toward points where the outlaws were expected to cross known streams or trails. Union Pacific special agents coordinated the separate efforts. They consulted with Hadsell on escape routes and studied maps that showed water sources and old freight roads leading south toward Browns Park and other outlaw haunts. They knew from earlier work that the men who hit the train did not operate blindly. Every robbery had followed careful scouting of the line, the schedule, and the shipments. The same level of planning would shape the escape, and a careless rider or unplanned stop would provide the best chance for a posse to close in. The posse train carrying McDaniel's men rolled west along the same rails that Number 3 had traveled hours before. When it reached the stretch near Table Rock, the car doors slid open and horses came out one by one. The animals stamped and shook their heads after the confinement. Saddles came out after them, along with rifles and scabbards and ammunition belts. The men mounted quickly. Local section hands and the railroad crew pointed out the exact spot where the holdup had occurred and showed the raw edges of blast damage that still marked the express car. Trackers dismounted and bent over the ground. In the hard morning light, the prints of shod hooves showed clearly in some stretches and faintly in others. The men followed them away from the right-of-way, spreading out to keep sight of every sign. The line of tracks led toward higher ground and then into a chain of draws that formed the outer fringe of the Red Desert. Here, each rider's judgment came into play, weighing whether the robbers had pushed straight for distance or zigzagged to shake anyone who tried to follow. For a time, the sign held steady. The posses pushed on, trading short comments and pointing out each fresh mark, each place where a horse had stumbled or paused. Heat began to build even in the morning as the sun rose. Sweat darkened saddle blankets. Dust lifted from under every hoof. Lawmen who had spent years on the plains settled into the strain of a long chase. They knew that a man could ride only so far before his horse began to show fatigue, and that an outlaw who did not manage his mounts carefully would eventually leave clues in the form of spent animals or uneven tracks. South of the tracks, the outlaw riders continued their own push, moving toward the broken country that led toward the borderlands shared by Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. There, in places like Browns Park and the approaches to distant canyon country, sympathizers and old associates kept small ranches and line camps that could hide a group for a few days. The men who had just robbed train number 3 counted on that set of safe points and on the knowledge that each mile of empty land between them and the rails would force their pursuers to slow and choose their path with care. Through the first full day after the robbery, the distance between hunters and hunted narrowed and widened by turns but never closed. At one point, the posses reached a place where the outlaw horses had been changed, a clear indication of planning. Fresh tracks of new mounts led away from that improvised remount station. The spent animals, left to graze and wander, moved off on their own paths and added confusion. The lawmen noted each detail and pressed on, knowing that every hour spent sorting out the signs gave the robbers more time to reach rougher cover. Clouds began to build in the afternoon over distant ranges. Men who had worked the range for years read the darkening sky as a warning of rain. On open ground, a shower would cool tired horses and riders. In tracking country, it would wash out the very signs they needed. Marshal Hadsell, riding with one of the groups, watched the sky and urged his men to make use of every visible mark before the first drops fell. By late in the day, wind gusts lifted dust and bent the sparse grass in wide arcs. The first scattered drops struck hats and rifle stocks, leaving dark spots that spread quickly. As the light began to fade on August 30th, the tracks the posses had followed since morning started to blur. In low spots, the prints softened and melted into damp earth. On higher ridges, the film of dust that had held the shape of horseshoes turned to slick mud under another brief squall. Men who had spent their lives reading trails recognized the limit that weather imposed. They spread out, searching for any remaining sign, yet in place after place the ground showed only smeared impressions. The trail that led from the wrecked express car toward the outlaw refuges to the south was breaking under the rainfall. Night came on with the smell of wet sage and damp earth replacing the dry dust that had filled nostrils during the day. The posses made camp in scattered draws, each group posting guards and tying horses where they could graze without wandering. Fires were kept small and shielded. Men spoke in low tones about the day's work and the frustration of seeing clear tracks vanish under the rain. They knew that by morning they would have to rely more on judgment and less on hard physical signs. The country ahead remained wide, carved with canyons and mesas. The men they hunted were mounted, armed, and now reinforced by a fortune in easily traded goods. Back on the line, the damaged express car stood in a siding, a visual reminder for every crew that passed. Workers photographed the wreckage and measured the torn steel door for reports that would travel to company offices and to detectives. At Green River, Rawlins, Cheyenne, and points beyond, reward notices were already being drafted. Posters promised $1,000 from the railroad and the express company for each robber delivered to custody or killed. Within days, additional offers raised the value on the heads of the Wild Bunch riders to $3,000 apiece, a figure that matched the seriousness with which officials now regarded train robbery on their lines. By the end of that long day and night, the men who had blasted open the Tipton Express safe rode deeper into rugged country with bulging saddlebags and a sense of victory. At the same time, the telegraph wires, newspaper offices, and law agencies of multiple states had fixed on their crime as an urgent problem. The train that had carried watches, mail, and passengers now carried the story of the holdup in every direction. The Tipton robbery had made a group of already known bandits richer in goods and cash, and it had set in motion the broadest and most determined pursuit they had yet faced. The hot season was still heavy over Wyoming when railroad agents and law officers gathered in Cheyenne on the last morning of August 1900. Telegraph messages describing the Tipton holdup lay spread across desks in the Union Pacific offices. Men who had spent their lives around rails and freight tables ran their fingertips over the words that described another blown express car, more terror among passengers, and a gang that had slipped away without leaving a usable trail. The newspapers in town put compositors to work as fast as ink and metal allowed, and by afternoon headlines on street corners called Tipton a second Wilcox, with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch mentioned by name. The Cheyenne Daily Leader printed a summary based on the railroad's own report and interviews with train crew members taken in Rawlins. It described the masked riders, the detached express car, the smashed safes, and the broken watch cases that littered the floor. The article carried the official statement that only $50.40 in cash had been lost from the express safe, along with a large number of watches and watch movements cleared from a shipment bound east. That figure went into the permanent record of the company and the American Express people, even as men at bar rooms up and down the line told one another that the robbers had made off with sacks of currency and gold. Telegraph copy reached Denver, Omaha, Chicago, and New York in quick succession. Editors who remembered the Wilcox robbery 1 year earlier recognized the same pattern and gave the new story front-page space. In Denver, commuters stepping off streetcars read that Union Pacific Train number 3 had been stopped once more in the Wyoming emptiness, and that the gang responsible for the earlier heist had returned to the same hunting ground. In eastern cities, the story ran alongside news of industrial strikes and overseas crises, but the details from Tipton stood out. The idea that masked riders could still halt an overland train in daylight after years of investment in law enforcement hit nerves in boardrooms and parlors as much as it did in section houses. In Chicago, clerks at the Pinkerton National Detective Agency mounted a fresh file in a cabinet already thick with Wild Bunch material. They recorded the date, the time, the location at Tipton, and the method used. They added notes that the outlaws had detached the express car, forced the crew away, and used dynamite once more. The boilerplate words on the file cover looked routine, but the men who wrote them understood what the repetition meant. The gang had not been driven abroad or scattered. It had simply recovered its strength after the Wilcox job and had chosen to strike again on the same railroad line. Union Pacific security officers increased patrols on vulnerable stretches of track. Section foremen received instructions to watch practice cuts where a locomotive could be stalled or a car uncoupled. Extra, guards rode express cars on some trains, and some stations were told to keep lantern signals ready for passing crews to warn of suspicious riders in the vicinity. Company officials quietly discussed raising the rewards already posted for Harvey Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, and others in the Wild Bunch circle. The superintendent at Cheyenne prepared circulars reminding employees that carelessness in handling information regarding shipments or train scheduling could be as dangerous as a misplaced wrench near a coupling. While these measures unfolded in towns and depots, the men who had robbed the train moved west and south, keeping clear of populated valleys. Accounts from ranchers and sheep camps over the next weeks, later collected by law officers, placed small groups of strangers riding fast through the country, changing horses and buying supplies in ones and twos at lonely stores. The descriptions often matched known photographs of Wild Bunch men that had been circulated since the Fort Worth group portrait appeared in newspapers. Women who ran boarding houses along stage roads mentioned quiet lodgers whose names did not appear in any register and who paid in gold or crisp currency before leaving at short notice. Some of the gang headed toward Colorado and then Texas, where Fort Worth still offered anonymity to men with money and good clothes. Others, including riders linked to Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in later reports, turned toward the sage and lava rock country that stretched across Utah and Nevada. Their path took them through dry basins, across salt flats where hooves sank into white crust, and over low mountain passes where scattered pine broke the skyline. They avoided railroad towns when possible, cutting around them by night to fill canteens at ranch wells or creek crossings, then slipping back into open country before dawn. Law officers tried to keep pace, but the distances worked against them. Posses from Carbon and Sweetwater counties pushed west as far as their jurisdictions and budgets allowed before the expense of feed, ammunition, and wages forced them back. Wyoming sheriffs communicated with Nevada and Utah counterparts through telegraph offices, sending physical descriptions and warning that men responsible for Tipton might be passing through under assumed names. Many counties lacked the money or manpower to keep long patrols on trails where no specific crime had occurred yet. In early September, 3 mounted men began to appear intermittently near Winnemucca, Nevada. They camped in reaches of rough ground where willows lined the Humboldt River and where their fires could be hidden in ravines. Local residents noticed them at a distance, riding good horses with northern saddles and gear that looked different from the tack used by area cowboys. When they came into town, they did so in plain clothing that would not draw attention in any railroad community, but they watched more than they spoke. Winnemucca in 1900 was a junction point for ranchers, railroad men, and miners moving between camps. The town's main commercial streets featured brick and frame buildings with wooden sidewalks, hitching rails, and a steady flow of wagons and riders. The First National Bank stood on a corner at Bridge Street and 4th Street, with a view down the street toward the railroad tracks. Farmers and merchants went through its doors each week to deposit receipts and withdraw cash for payrolls or cattle buys. The bank belonged to the American Bankers Association, which meant that when trouble came, its officers had access to the investigative reach of Pinkerton detectives as well as local law. Witnesses later told investigators that 3 strangers spent several days taking the measure of the town. They rode along Bridge Street in the adjoining lanes, counted horses at livery barns, and used saloons and stores without drawing trouble. They watched the First National Bank from across the way, studying who entered and when. They noted that midday brought a lull when most ranch hands were eating and some merchants were away from their counters. They also observed the route from the bank corner out of town toward open country, including side streets where fresh horses could be kept out of view. On Wednesday, September 19, 1900, the air over Winnemucca carried the warmth of late summer. Shortly before noon, 3 mounted men rode into town and dismounted in a casual way near the heart of the business district. They tied their horses, straightened their coats, and walked together toward the First National Bank. The street carried the ordinary sounds of a workday with wagon wheels on packed earth, the ring of a distant hammer, and low voices from shop doors. Nothing in that moment warned citizens that an armed robbery was minutes away. At the bank entrance, the trio paused only briefly before stepping inside. Once over the threshold, they drew revolvers and presented them at the employees and customers. A teller and the cashier, who had been working behind the counter handling deposits and ledgers, found themselves staring down the dark barrels of pistols held by men wearing simple masks. The robbers told everyone present to raise their hands and back away from the counter. One of them vaulted or moved behind the counter space, forcing the clerk away from the drawers, while another kept his weapon trained on the room. The bank staff had no armed guard, and any attempt to reach a weapon concealed under a counter risked immediate death. Customers who had come in for routine business froze, then obeyed as the robbers ordered them to lie face down on the floor. Boots scraped on the wooden planks as men tried to comply without making any sudden moves. Papers, receipts, and a ledger book dropped from the clerk's hands and scattered. The robber behind the counter demanded the keys to the safe and cash drawers. The cashier, under the gun and with no practical alternative, produced them. The outlaws worked fast as they had at trains. They opened drawers and stacked currency and coins into canvas sacks. They concentrated on gold pieces, knowing that these held value in any jurisdiction and could be hidden in saddlebags or pack rolls more easily than bulky paper. Inside the safe, they located bags of $20 gold coins that had been stored for shipment or for use in larger transactions. One robber hauled the heavy bags out, muscles visibly straining under the weight, while another kept his pistol moving to discourage any thought of resistance. The third man watched the front windows and door, ready to respond if anyone appeared on the threshold. Outside, a few passers-by noticed unusual movement inside the bank, but at first nothing seemed clear enough to raise an alarm. The men inside the lobby, however, felt every second stretch. A clerk later described the raw sound of one robber's voice and the smell of dust and leather that filled the room as the sacks were dragged. The bandits forced an employee to step away from a side desk and pushed him toward the others lying on the floor, then returned to stripping out valuables. They made no effort to search pockets. Their focus remained on the bank's cash reserves. Within minutes, the sacks held a substantial sum, later reported as more than $32,000 in gold and currency. The leader gave a curt signal. The three men backed toward the door, pistols still in hand. Before stepping out, one of them warned the room that anyone who tried to follow would be shot down in the street. Then they slipped onto the sidewalk and turned toward their horses. At that point, someone in the neighborhood grasped what was happening and shouted an alarm. The sight of masked men carrying canvas sacks toward saddled horses told the rest of the story more clearly than any words could. Several townsmen ran for weapons, some from nearby stores and offices, others from the direction of the livery. The robbers mounted in practiced sequence, swung the heavy sacks up and dug in their spurs. Hooves struck sparks from stones as they drove their horses forward. Gunfire cracked almost at once. A storekeeper fired from a doorway, his shot going wild and splintering wood near the bank front. Another citizen, crouched behind a watering trough, managed to send bullets close enough that one outlaw turned in the saddle and returned fire. Accounts describe bullets striking dust in the street and smashing glass in a nearby window. A horse shied as shots passed close, but the riders kept control and pushed on. As the trio galloped down Bridge Street, more shots rang out behind them. One man, firing from the steps of another building, emptied his revolver and then ducked as return fire chipped brick near his head. The robbers did not stop to aim carefully. Their goal was to keep heads down long enough to reach the edge of town. They split their path slightly as they neared a corner, forcing any would-be pursuer to choose a line of fire. Witnesses saw dust rising behind the horses as they crossed a bridge and veered toward open country where prearranged fresh mounts waited. Within minutes of the robbery, Winnemucca erupted into activity. The cashier and staff, shaken but alive, locked the bank doors once they were sure the robbers had gone and began to assess the loss. Messengers sprinted to the sheriff's office, to the telegraph station, and to nearby businesses where men had access to horses and firearms. A hastily assembled posse mounted within a short time, some riders still in shirt sleeves. They followed the most obvious trail out of town, looking for tracks where a switch to fresh horses might have occurred. The robbers had planned their escape with care. Outside of town, in draws and behind low rises, they had tethered rested horses and prepared to discard any gear that might slow them. When they reached those points, they shifted the gold into new saddlebags, changed mounts, and drove the tired animals off so that a single continuous trail would be harder to follow. They then pressed into broken country, using gullies, dry creek beds, and patches of brush to hide their passage. The initial posse lost ground as the day went on. The heavy dust stirred by the robbers' first mounts drifted and settled, making tracks harder to read. Riders who had come out in haste began to feel the strain of the chase. Horses lathered and slowed. With no clear idea whether the outlaws had headed toward California, Utah, or back toward Idaho and Wyoming, the sheriff faced a difficult decision. He could scatter his small force in multiple directions and risk losing all contact, or keep them together and try to work out the route in detail from sign and guesswork. By evening, a second kind of pursuit had already begun that did not depend on tracks in dust. Telegraph operators in Winnemucca transmitted a detailed description of the robbery and the men involved. The message went to Reno, Carson City, Ogden, Salt Lake City, and other points along the rail lines. Then east toward Cheyenne and Denver. It went as well to Pinkerton field offices and to American Bankers Association contacts. Within a day, bankers and law officers across several states knew that a trio of armed men had walked into the First National Bank of Winnemucca at noon and walked out with more than $32,000. In Cheyenne and Rawlins, Union Pacific officers compared the Winnemucca account with the recent Tipton train robbery and with the Wilcox holdup the year before. The same names surfaced in conversation and on paper. Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Kid Curry, and other Wild Bunch regulars already carried high bounties on their heads. Their known skill with horses, their willingness to use explosives or revolvers as needed, and their habit of choosing targets far apart in distance but close together in time all pointed to their involvement here as well. Pinkerton analysts in Chicago reached similar conclusions when reports crossed their desks. Some accounts in the press stated flatly that Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had personally entered the bank. Later research, studying travel timelines and other documents, has shown that there are conflicts in some of those early stories. What is certain is that law enforcement agencies at the time treated Winnemucca as a Wild Bunch crime. Pinkerton circulars and American Bankers Association bulletins listed the robbery alongside Wilcox and Tipton in the gang's record. Photographs of known gang members, including the Fort Worth portrait, circulated once more as warnings to railroads, stage lines, and banks. The scale of the Winnemucca loss and the boldness of a midday robbery in a busy town pushed the issue of frontier banditry back into national headlines. Newspapers in San Francisco, Denver, Salt Lake City, Chicago, and New York carried detailed reports. Some editorials argued that law enforcement west of the Missouri needed larger budgets and better coordination. Others pointed out that banks and railroads had grown comfortable with isolated guards and light security despite years of spectacular robberies. Pressure grew on companies and counties alike to fortify vulnerable points. In the months that followed, banks in many Western communities reviewed their procedures. Some hired watchmen or armed guards for the first time. Others installed stronger safes, gave staff clear instructions about how to react during a robbery to minimize bloodshed, and worked more closely with agencies like Pinkerton. Railroad companies, already stung by earlier heists, renewed their own measures, from reinforcing express car doors to assigning special agents on certain routes. The image of 3 men walking out of a bank at noon with sacks of gold in plain sight did not sit well with stockholders or directors. For the smaller ranchers, miners, and townspeople who read about Winnemucca in weeklies that came by rail or stage, the story carried another message. The old idea of romantic outlaws who robbed faceless corporations and spared ordinary citizens lost some of its charm when a community bank, dependent on local deposits, stood stripped of its reserves. Farmers who had recently deposited their season's earnings felt the risk in a direct way. Wage earners who took coin from those banks as pay understood that such robberies threatened their livelihoods as much as any distant shareholders. By December 1900, the combined effect of the Tipton train robbery and the Winnemucca bank job had altered the landscape of crime and law in the West. The Wild Bunch and its associates had gained money and notoriety from the two strikes, but the attention they drew brought heavier pursuit than before. Pinkerton files on the gang thickened with new reports. State and territorial governors received letters from citizens demanding firmer action. The United States Senate heard renewed discussion of interstate law enforcement cooperation, with members citing the difficulty of tracking criminals who could cross from one jurisdiction to another on horseback in a single day while paperwork lagged behind. The atmosphere in frontier towns shifted as well. Where some had once chuckled over tales of outlaws taking money from distant railroads, men now checked the doors of their own banks and watched the movements of unfamiliar riders with a little more caution. Sheriff's offices in Nevada, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado kept wanted posters for the Wild Bunch visible in front rooms where visitors could not miss them. The Tipton train robbery and the Winnemucca bank holdup had brought more than gold and watches into outlaw hands. They had pushed the region toward a point where the open-range outlaw era itself would face its own reckoning. February 20th, 1901, New York Harbor lay under cold air and a low gray sky as a British steamer named Herminius stood at her pier with smoke drifting from her funnels and gangways busy with last-minute traffic. Near one of the gangways, 3 people moved with their collars turned up and their hats low. The ticket under the name James Ryan covered passage for a woman and her brother on the liner bound for Buenos Aires. The man who used that name answered to George Parker among his own circle, and to Butch Cassidy in every Pinkerton file west of the Missouri. The quiet man beside him had lived under the names Harry Longabaugh and Sundance Kid. The woman between them, Etta Place, walked as if an ordinary traveler, yet each glance she cast behind them measured the space between their party and anyone who might recognize the faces from wanted bulletins. As they stepped up the gangway, the harbor noise wrapped around them. Ship bells, mule hooves on cobbles, calls from stevedores, and the slap of water against hulls. None of that masked the steady awareness shared by the two outlaws that every large station, depot, and hotel in the country now held their likeness in glass cases or on rough paper. The Tipton train robbery in Wyoming and the Winnemucca bank holdup in Nevada had delivered money enough to dream of another life, yet they had also driven every rail company and bank association to sharpen their hunt. The Herminius offered a different route, a way out of the telegraph nets that had closed over so much of the West. Once the ship pulled away from the pier and the skyline blurred, Cassidy and Longabaugh slipped into the pattern of shipboard routine, keeping close to Etta and keeping conversation light in public rooms. They ate at assigned tables, walked the deck in the cold Atlantic wind, and kept their eyes on the horizon. Below the surface of that calm, the decision they had made carried its own weight. Years of holding up trains and banks across Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Nevada had proved that the country no longer allowed men like them to disappear between robberies. Pinkerton agents could ride trains, wire descriptions, and follow money through banks from one town to another. A ranch in a distant land promised room to breathe. After the crossing, the group disembarked at Buenos Aires and passed through customs as an American family seeking land. Spanish words filled the air. Streetcars rattled past the docks and the smell of the river mixed with coal smoke from engines. Cassidy and the Sundance Kid met shipping agents and bought tickets that would carry them westward toward Patagonia. Their path led across the pampas on narrow gauge rails and wagon roads, away from the capital's brick fronts and into open country with scattered estancias, wind, and distant snow on the Andean line. Somewhere in that movement, the money taken in Nevada and elsewhere changed form, from gold and banknotes into deeds and livestock. The east bank of the Rio Blanco, near a place locals called Cholila, the two outlaws and Etta established a ranch that covered a broad stretch of grass and timber. They raised a log house with 4 rooms, built corrals, and hired local labor where needed. Neighbors saw 3 quiet North Americans who bought cattle, sheep, and horses, paid in cash, and minded their own business. Cassidy introduced himself under his alias and talked with the ease of a man who had grown up around stock. The Sundance Kid worked alongside him, breaking horses and riding lines to check fences. By 1902, the ranch carried hundreds of head and a reputation for solid management. From Wyoming and Colorado, the view of these developments came secondhand through letters and financial traces. Pinkerton men in Chicago and Denver learned that 3 North Americans had purchased a large holding in distant Patagonia, and that significant funds had moved through banks connected with the First National Bank of Winnemucca. Investigators compared dates and amounts and saw the echo of earlier robberies. They gathered passenger lists from ships sailing out of New York and fixed on the February sailing of the Herminius with James Ryan and his sister on the manifest. Bit by bit, the agency extended its map of the Wild Bunch from the high plains of Wyoming into the far south of another continent. Back in the northern Rockies, the part of the gang that remained on American soil continued to work in the only trade it knew. On July 3, 1901, Kid Curry led a group of men along the Great Northern Line near the small station of Wagner, Montana. They watched a stretch where the railroad crossed rolling ground broken by brush and shallow ravines and chose a point where a train could be halted and still leave room to maneuver. Couriers brought word that an express car with a full shipment of currency would be passing. The men checked their rifles, their dynamite, and the relay horses they had placed out of sight. When the Great Northern train approached in the summer heat, the robbers forced it to a stop and moved along its length in practiced order. They separated the express section from the passenger coaches and drove it ahead with the locomotive, using the same basic method that had worked on the Union Pacific at Tipton. Once they had the car alone, they went at the safe with powder, tamping charges and blasting the door. The explosions echoed over the prairie and scattered splinters and iron fragments inside the compartment. When the noise died, sacks of paper money lay ready to be scooped into bags. The take in that car exceeded $60,000 in cash, a sum that would have covered many ranches the size of the one in Patagonia. The aftermath followed a hard pattern the gang understood well. The men split up as soon as they left the tracks, some riding toward remote ranch country and others toward towns where they could disappear into boarding houses and saloons. Sheriff Elijah Bryant in Texas, working with information from railroad detectives, later confronted Bill Carver in Sonora and shot him dead in a nighttime encounter that ended one more career tied to the Wild Bunch circle. Further east, Ben Kilpatrick and Laura Bullion carried part of the Wagner money into cities where the reach of law and Pinkerton men extended through every bank lobby. In October and November 1901, St. Louis police and Pinkerton agents closed a net around the pair. Traced banknotes led them to a resort on Chestnut Street where Kilpatrick was arrested. On him, they found a key to a room at the Laclede Hotel. The next morning, officers waited in the lobby and watched a woman who signed the register under an assumed name. When they searched her grips, they found thousands of dollars in unsigned banknotes identical to those taken from the Great Northern Express. She gave her name as Della Rose and then as Laura Bullion. Under questioning, she admitted that the money belonged to Ben Kilpatrick but refused to describe the robbery in detail. Federal courts moved quickly. Kilpatrick faced charges tied directly to the Wagner train robbery and received a 15-year sentence in federal prison. Bullion, charged as an accessory and carrier of stolen notes, stood before a Missouri judge who weighed her youth, her conduct, and the public pressure to punish anyone linked with the Wild Bunch. She drew a 5-year term in the Missouri State Penitentiary at Jefferson City. Once inside the stone walls, she joined the small number of women held there, living under strict routines of labor and confinement, while Kilpatrick rode farther east in shackles to begin his own long stretch. Two riders who had once moved freely across Wyoming and Texas now woke each day to count time between walls. Kid Curry did not intend to trade the saddle for a cell. After Wagner, he moved through safe houses and outlaw sympathizers, carrying with him the reputation of a man who had already killed law officers in several states. Late in the year 1901, he reached Knoxville, Tennessee, a city far removed from the open country where most Wild Bunch raids had taken place. There he spent money in saloons and gambling rooms, his manner controlled yet watched closely by those who had heard his name. City police, working with Pinkerton contacts, began to keep track of the stranger who tipped generously and carried himself like a man who weighed every doorway. On December 13, 1901, two Knoxville policemen, William Dinwiddle and Robert Saylor, approached Curry near a street corner to place him under arrest. The man they faced understood the risk of allowing himself to be walked into a cell under his own name. A fight broke out that shifted from the sidewalk into nearby spaces. Witnesses heard shouts, saw men grapple, and then heard gunfire at close range. When the echo faded, both officers lay dead, shot during the struggle. Curry fled the city, leaving behind bodies, spent cartridge cases, and another entry on a list of murdered peace officers linked to his name. For a time, he eluded capture, moving back toward the western country he knew best. Pinkerton bulletins and local reward posters now described him as the most dangerous of the remaining outlaws, a man who had taken the lives of sheriffs and town policemen alike. The agency continued to work angles through acquaintances and former companions. Della Moore, arrested in Knoxville on forgery and passing charges, drew her own sentence and became another thread in the file, a reminder of how far the gang's reach had extended and how closely connected its members had remained, even while running in separate groups. In November 1902, Knoxville officers finally brought Curry down inside a pool hall after a hard physical fight that left everyone bruised and bleeding. There he gave his name as Harvey Logan. The courts convicted him of robbery and sentenced him to 20 years of hard labor and a heavy fine. He entered the Knoxville jail as a high-risk prisoner, watched closely yet still studying the layout and routines as he had studied train timetables. Behind the brick and iron, his record of violent escape attempts in earlier years argued that confinement would never sit well. On June 27, 1903, he proved that judgment correct. Using a wire lasso, he caught a guard from behind, disarmed him, and forced the jailer to hand over keys and weapons. With 2 pistols in his belt, he walked out of the building, crossed a bridge on a stolen horse, and rode away in daylight while children watched from yards along the street. By nightfall, his trail began to blur in the hills and hollows beyond the city, leaving embarrassed officials and jubilant outlaw sympathizers to trade stories of the breakout. The following year showed how narrow the margin for an escaped train robber had become. In early June 1904, a small Denver and Rio Grande train paused near the Colorado town of Parachute. Masked men stopped it, went to the express car, and forced the messenger to surrender what valuables he guarded. As they pulled away from the scene, they stole fresh horses from a local rancher named Roll Gardner and a neighbor, leaving their own tired mounts behind. When Gardner and his neighbor found their corrals disturbed the next morning, they saddled replacement horses, armed themselves, and rode into the broken country above the river. Gardner and his neighbor soon met a posse of law officers who had already taken up the chase. Together they followed the trail into rough draws and ledges where scrub and rocks offered limited cover. Fresh tracks, scattered gear, and the bodies of the stolen horses shot down by the fleeing men marked the path. Late in the day, the posse closed to rifle range. Shots cracked back and forth across a shallow gulch. One fugitive tried to pick off Gardner's neighbor as the man ran for better ground. Gardner's reply shot struck the gunman, who went down hard. Wounded and seeing no clear way out, the outlaw on the ground chose his own end, drawing a sidearm and firing a single round into his head rather than wait for the posse to close in. When the lawmen reached the body, they compared the face, the build, and the scars with descriptions and photographs in their possession. They identified the dead man as Harvey Logan, called Kid Curry, the same outlaw whose hand had opened the express car at Tipton and whose bullets had killed officers across several states. The body went into the record as proof that one of the Wild Bunch's most violent men would ride no more. While Curry's last days unfolded in Colorado canyons, the life Cassidy and the Sundance Kid built in Patagonia came under its own pressure. Argentine authorities, alerted by communications from the United States and by reports of armed robberies in the southern provinces, began to look more closely at foreign ranchers with deep pockets and light histories. Investigators rode into the Rio Blanco Valley, spoke with neighbors, and examined brand records. Cassidy and Longabaugh answered questions politely, showed their herds and their homestead, and understood that the quiet they had purchased with Winnemucca gold and other takings would not last forever. By 1903, the two men and Etta Place had sold their Cholula ranch and prepared to move deeper into the interior. They shifted from the fixed life of landholders back into the pattern of travelers who carried watches, cash, and weapons, and who chose roads with an eye for escape routes. South American police files began to accumulate reports of robberies in which witnesses described foreign voices and riders who handled horses with the ease of long experience. The same traits that had made them effective in Wyoming and Nevada appeared again on dusty tracks in Argentina and later in Bolivia. Across the West, the combined effect of Tipton, Winnemucca, Wagner, Knoxville, Parachute, and the lesser-known killings and robberies attached to the Wild Bunch drew a clear picture. By 1904, the old pattern in which a man could raid a railroad or a bank and then vanish into a remote hideout had broken under the weight of telegraph wires, reward circulars, and coordinated pursuit. Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had been pushed off the continent. Kilpatrick and Bullion woke and slept to the count of guards' footsteps in distant prisons. Bill Carver lay in a grave in Texas. Kid Curry's body rested under Colorado soil. The train heist near Tipton and the money that followed it had made the gang rich enough to buy land and time. Yet every blast and every stolen dollar had also added weight to the forces that eventually scattered them across deserts, cell blocks, and foreign valleys. November 7, 1908. Word went out from the Bolivian mining camp of San Vicente that two foreign bandits lay dead in a small adobe house near the edge of town. The telegrams that followed described a brief fight, a dead soldier and two bodies with multiple bullet wounds found on the floor when local officers forced the door at first light. The names Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid did not appear in those first South American reports. Yet when translated summaries reached Pinkerton desks and railroad offices in the United States, experienced readers recognized details that fit men they had hunted since the days of Wilcox and Tipton. Two American riders used to payroll money and hard travel had tried once more for a mining company courier, and had ended the night on a bare floor surrounded by spent cartridges. In Chicago and Denver, Pinkerton supervisors added the San Vicente account to thick Wild Bunch files. For them, the news did not carry surprise that the last confirmed stand of the men tied to the Tipton train robbery had taken place thousands of miles from the Union Pacific Main Line. The pattern they had tracked showed how every successful attack on a train or bank drove the surviving outlaws farther from their original ground. After the express safe at Tipton had been blown apart and the Winnemucca Bank stripped of gold in broad daylight, Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had used the money to build a ranch in Patagonia, then to move again into deeper country when investigators closed in. The same sums that bought cattle and corrals for a time had also pushed the hunt to a new continent and kept the names of the gang in every bulletin case. Back in Wyoming, the stretch of track near Tipton that had once echoed with the blast of dynamite resumed its ordinary business. Freight trains rolled past carrying coal, lumber, ore, and manufactured goods between the Missouri Valley and the Pacific coast. Passenger trains carried families, salesmen, soldiers, and migrants who saw only a named station post and wide country on either side. Yet for the men responsible for guarding the line, that section remained a reference point whenever new agents learned the history of the road. They studied photographs of the ruined express car, read transcripts of the testimony from Charles Woodcock and E.J. Kerrigan, and understood that 1 year of carelessness had allowed the same gang to hit Union Pacific trains twice in 2 seasons. The company and its peers did not treat that repetition as an isolated embarrassment. By the early years of the new century, the Union Pacific Secret Service under Chief Special Agent William Canada had taken firm shape, with men stationed along the line whose only work was to investigate thefts and prevent robberies. Under General Manager E. Dickinson, the railroad organized a mounted force that reporters and employees called the Bandit Hunters. Riders who kept their horses in gear in a special baggage car and traveled with a telegrapher and locomotive reserved for rapid response. When a wire reported trouble, this small detachment could roll out of Cheyenne or another division point with its own dining and sleeping cars and reach a holdup site faster than scattered posses had managed in the past. Canada recruited men who could ride long distances, shoot straight, and read the country. They were paid by the railroad, not by a county, and answered to company officers rather than to a single town's voters. That arrangement gave them freedom to cross county lines without pausing for new commissions. It also meant that an outlaw who stopped a train in Wyoming might find himself hunted 50 or 100 miles into another territory by the same group that had ridden out from the first report. The bandit hunters did not prevent Tipton, but the outrage that followed the blown express car and the shaken crew reinforced the argument inside the company that such a permanent force was necessary. And it ensured that the next group of would-be train robbers met organized resistance instead of scattered volunteers. Other railroads watched these developments and strengthened their own arrangements. The Denver and Rio Grande, the Santa Fe, and the Southern Pacific carried their own special agents who worked with local sheriffs yet maintained their own files and paymasters. In the East, where the lines ran through closer settled country, railroads relied on uniformed officers with rank structures similar to city police departments. In the West, they tended to favor plainclothes men who could blend in with cowhands and miners while watching yards, depots, and isolated sidings. Across the continent, the title railroad detective or railroad special agent came to mark a professional whose training and daily work focused on theft from interstate shipments, vandalism, and the rare but dangerous armed robberies that still troubled the lines. State legislatures and courts supported this transition from improvised posses to formal security. Laws on several books recognized railroad police as officers with the power to make arrests on and near company property. When questions arose regarding pursuit beyond the immediate yard limits, judges weighed the needs of interstate commerce against older notions that only county officers could carry authority. Gradually, statutes gave clear standing to company officers operating under commissions from governors or sheriffs, and procedures emerged for recognizing railroad police credentials in multiple jurisdictions. The presence of a badge on a coat lapel or pinned inside a vest at a station became more common. Federal lawmakers responded as well. In the years after Tipton and Winnemucca, Congress paid more attention to crimes committed on trains carrying mail and interstate freight. Postal inspectors had long pursued people who tampered with mail sacks or rifled registered letters. Now, members of Congress considered measures that treated entering a railroad train to commit a violent felony as a national concern, rather than only a local one. New provisions in federal criminal law made it possible to charge a man who boarded a train in a territory or federal district with intent to rob under statutes that carried severe prison terms, no matter where within that jurisdiction the holdup occurred. Pinkerton's own role changed in this period. In earlier decades, private detectives had filled gaps where federal and state law offered little organized manpower. By the opening years of the 20th century, local police departments had grown and federal agencies such as the Bureau of Investigation, later the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had begun to take a more active role in interstate cases. Pinkerton offices in Chicago, Denver, and New York still tracked cases for railroads, banks, and express companies, but their work in the Wild Bunch story marked one of the last large-scale manhunts of the old type, conducted largely on horseback with coded telegrams and paper files. The San Vicente reports and the scattered arrests that followed Tipton showed how far that model could reach, and how heavy the combined pressure of corporate and public law enforcement could become for any gang that stayed in one trade too long. At the same time, popular culture seized on the very robberies that had pushed lawmen toward greater coordination. In 1903, a short motion picture titled The Great Train Robbery placed images of masked men stopping a train, firing guns, and fleeing a posse before audiences in Nickelodeons and larger theaters. The storyline reflected techniques already familiar from Wilcox, Tipton, and other real holdups, using scenes of an uncoupled car and frightened passengers. A few years later, William F. Cody's Wild West show added an arena act called The Great Holdup and Bandit Hunters of the Union Pacific, in which a staged train robbery ended with a mounted posse chasing actors playing bandits. Families who watched that act saw a neat, contained version of what passengers on train number 3 and crewmen like Woodcock had lived as blow after blow in the dark, without certainty that any posse at all would arrive. Newspapers and dime novels told their own versions. Reporters who had written breathless accounts of the Wilcox and Tipton holdups now quoted law officers describing the end of men like Harvey Logan and Bill Carver in Colorado draws and Texas towns. Some writers leaned heavily on images of gallant outlaws, downplaying murders and terrified victims. Others emphasized the cold facts of bodies left in alleys, on canyon floors, or in lonely graveyards, and described widows, children, and railroad workers left to live with the consequences. Between these two tendencies, a new public understanding developed in which the Wild Bunch and similar gangs stood both as figures in sensational adventure stories and as real criminals whose choices had forced railroads, banks, and governments to change their ways. On the ground, the shift away from open-range train robbery showed up in smaller details. Express messengers still rode, but their cars came equipped with improved safes, stronger doors, and sometimes barred windows. Mail clerks handled registered pouches under closer accounting and behind locked inner doors. Passenger conductors received clearer instructions on how to respond if a crewman saw an obstruction ahead, or a signal fire burning in a place that did not appear on orders. Telegraph operators understood that any report of suspicious riders near a vulnerable stretch of track required immediate forwarding, not a note left for the next shift. By the 19-teens, as automobiles took more freight from city depots and trucks began to supplement rail service, the classic image of men on horseback forcing a train to a halt in open country started to fade as a practical threat. Robbery attempts did not vanish, but organized gangs found themselves facing steel cars, air brakes, and professional railroad police who could radio or telegraph ahead faster than any horse could run. The old pattern in which a gang could halt a train, spend long minutes blasting a safe, and still escape into breaks and canyons without immediate organized pursuit no longer fit the realities of an increasingly wired and policed landscape. In Wyoming and neighboring states, sheriffs kept their rifles oiled and their saddles ready, yet the proportion of their time spent on train robberies diminished. They dealt more often with cattle theft, town shootings, labor disputes, and the growing list of crimes that came with mining camps and oil fields. When they spoke of train holdups, it was often in the past tense, marking Wilcox and Tipton as turning points. Younger deputies learned the stories as cautionary examples of what had happened when outlaws exploited long stretches of underprotected line, and how quickly the railroads and the law had reacted once those losses grew too noticeable to ignore. Economic changes reinforced the shift, as banks and businesses adopted new methods of transferring funds, including drafts and telegraphic transfers. The amount of physical currency carried in a single express shipment declined in relative terms. Valuable cargo still moved by rail, but the role of the express safe as a central target for a gang seeking one life-changing haul weakened. At the same time, insurance companies that underwrote bank and railroad losses demanded better security practices and sometimes required proof of improved guards and procedures before they renewed policies at favorable rates. The calculations that had once made a train robbery seem worth the risks to men like Cassidy now favored closed vaults, guarded depots, and better coordination between corporate and public law. By the early 1920s, the scene at a remote siding on the Union Pacific looked very different from the one train Number 3 had faced outside Tipton in 1900. Telegraph wires ran along the line in denser networks, and telephone links complemented them near towns. A report of gunfire or an unexplained signal could reach several offices in minutes. A special agent could board a locomotive with a small team and ride straight to the reported trouble, confident that other officers already waited at likely road crossings and ranch tracks ahead. Passengers sitting behind drawn shades in night coaches now worried more about schedule delays and crowded berths than about masked men forcing the crew to uncouple the head end and roll it into the dark. For the men who had once used dynamite and six-shooters as working tools, there was no easy place left in that changed landscape. Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had turned the proceeds of Tipton and Winnemucca into cattle and fences on a distant continent, then into travel money and weapons again when the law drew close in Argentina and Bolivia. Kid Curry had carried the memory of the blasted express car into later robberies and killings that ended with his body in Colorado soil. Ben Kilpatrick had spent a decade in a federal penitentiary and later died under the gunfire of guards in Texas. Each step in that sequence can be traced back in company files and wanted circulars to the decision to stop a Union Pacific train near a little siding named Tipton and to tear open its safe. On certain clear evenings in later years, freight crews running west from Rawlins could still point from the cab window toward the low-rise where the express car once stood alone under Woodcock's horrified gaze. There was no marker on the ground, only sage and soil, but older railroaders who had read the investigation reports or heard the stories from men who had been there sometimes told younger firemen and engineers that this was where one of the last big Western train robberies had carried itself out in full. Behind them, steel cars carried sealed freight under the protection of modern locks, and the quiet authority of railroad police whose badges gave them powers across long distances. The Tipton train heist had poured new money into the pockets of the Wild Bunch and helped send two of its leaders as far as the Andes. Yet it had also drawn so much focused anger and organization from railroads, governments, and communities that the age of the open-range train robber could not survive it.